And the recording is starting. And then if you want to get in position here so that I can kind of see you. Yeah, where you're going to be. There. Hey, hi, Jeff.
Didn't know you were coming on that.
How would I miss you?
I don't know. It's going to be on Zoom. It's going to be awesome. Okay. Hopefully all that energy comes through me.
Hi.
Good still?
I'm just going to do a couple of just things.
Okay.
All right, so if you're here and you're not registered, okay, please go on to the Midwest Brainspotting Institute website and register. If you're a member, it's free. If you're not, you know that there's a fee for today. We use this as opportunities for fundraising for Brainspotting. It's also a member benefit for those of you that are members. One of the reasons we need to have you guys register is that we're gonna follow up with surveys, like so that we can learn, you know, what's working and what's not working and so forth. And so we know what the numbers are. If you are getting CEs, okay, you have to sign a sheet over here because those get submitted to the CE body that gives us our Cassidy that will later send the CEs through email. If you have, it usually takes anywhere to 4, at the most 8 weeks to get those because we submit all the sheets and then they verify you've been here and that you've paid and then they send out the CE. If you have any problems with that, you can follow up with myself or Deb on the board. Okay. Pardon me?
What's the fee for this?
15. You get 3 CEs today for 15. And again, if you go on the calendar at Midwest Brainspotting Institute where you registered for here, there, and it says you want CEs, yes. You click on yes, it gives you the link. You got to register online, and that money goes to our Cassidy. We don't even collect any of that or anything. It's a link, and it's right on the website. Okay. And you can still register for CEs today if you decide that you want the 3 CEs. Okay. For most of you, I think I know most of you, but if you don't, my name is Sherry Lindberg. I'm the president of the Midwest Brainspotting Board. And Deb Bongers, who might be leading people up here, I'm not sure where she's at. Did she? Okay. She's also part of the board, and she helped organize this. Like when you had questions, it said contact, you know, Deb. She's the one that's been sending out the emails. She's the secretary. Okay. And without further ado, I will introduce Josh here. You want to tell him a little bit about yourself and how you got started in Brainspotting?
Oh.
How does that sound?
I'm Josh Delahan, and I got started in Brainspotting because of Steve Sawyer, famous Steve Sawyer. He runs the Division Wilderness up in northern Wisconsin and also out in Bend, Oregon. And he asked if I would come do some EMDR. I said EMDR, the Brainspotting function up there, because that's all I did at the time. And after a year or so, he started saying, "Hey, have you heard of Brainspotting?" You know? He said you should check it out. It's as good as EMDR or better. And so I said, okay, I'll check it out. And so then he gave me some DVDs, and I started doing it with my clients and found amazing results. And so then finally got trained. Sheree trained me very well. And Laura Hillshine, who's also a member of the board, they both trained me. Then I got trained. You know, that's official. So if you've only done the DVDs, you might want to do a live in-person training. It's much different. It was much better. I really understood it much more. Then I took the phase 2, and then Sheree was my mentor and my consultant, and I am in the process of getting certified. I just have to send my stuff in basically, and I'll be certified. And that's my story. I run the peer support group here in Milwaukee. So if you're not a part of that, if you want to come join us once a month, you can email me. I can give you my card. You can email me, and I'll put you on the list.
And you're on the board.
I'm on the board. Midwest Brainspotting Institute.
Yeah. Thanks, Deb.
New edition in April. So, yeah. All of those things are my brain.
You might need to speak up a little bit. They're
Okay.
saying they're having a hard time hearing you.
All right. So is the microphone like maybe closer over here? Can you hear me if I stand over here better?
I can look. then if that's the case, I can get out of your way here too.
Fine. So this is.
Yes, when you're over here, it's better. She
Okay,
said.
all right, so I'm gonna hang out over here. So the title is Understanding Dissociation and Using Brainspotting with Dissociative Clients to Improve Overall Health. Woo, that's a mouthful. Hopefully I can live up to all of that stuff. But basically what I'm gonna be talking about is dissociation in general, and then a little bit more specific modalities that we can use with dissociation, and then how do we incorporate brain spotting into it. So it's kind of going to be a little bit of a long road to get to brain spotting, but it has to be if you're working with dissociative clients. So it will kind of match what you'll be doing with them. So this isn't going to work, though. It was working earlier.
Yeah. Can you get it? Is it on?
Is this thing on?
There you go.
All right. So we always start whenever we have class, as my students know, I have former students here. We always start with questions and/or concerns. So what are your biggest questions or concerns about working with clients with dissociation, just so I can kind of get an idea of what you're looking for, and I can maybe focus on those areas and have less focus on other areas. So does anybody have any questions or concerns about working with dissociation? Why are you here? Or just generally, you just want to see what happens. That's fine too. What's really good is, that was a picture that I found on my computer that had the most either question or concern. You're not quite sure, does she have a question or was she concerned about something? So that was a good match. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about clients who you identify as having multiple parts.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so where Monty was asking about people that have multiple parts, so DID and probably ego states. Yeah, so we'll definitely be discussing that for sure. Yeah.
Also,
Celia.
clients who, even when doing grounding or to be present in the writing, they can't stand that. It's so hard for them to connect with their eyes. So how to work with them when they're so dissociated.
Okay, so in session, you mean when you're trying to use brain spotting or just anything?
When trying to do brain spotting, and I've seen a few who are just with anything, so dissociated.
Okay, so just clients that are dissociating in the session, and maybe if you're trying to use brain spotting, they just can't seem to do it. Yeah.
They can hear you much better when you're looking to the left, is what
Okay.
the feedback is.
All right. Well,
Trying to help.
I'm gonna go back and forth.
I know.
I'm gonna do my own bilateral stimulation there. So,
There you go.
So I'll do my best. I'm used to looking at this crowd, at college. So
For me, it's like now I'm dealing with a client that sometimes I don't know if it's dissociation or DID or is going to schizophrenia or so. Sometimes to differentiate that.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me.
yeah. So I have thoughts about that for
Yeah,
sure.
okay.
It's not incorporated in this.
Oh,
So at the end, maybe if you have a question about that, if we have time,
Okay.
definitely ask it, and I have my own thoughts
Great.
about that stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Is there?
Yeah, just, I've done this with, some pretty dissociative clients, but again, at the end, they have definitely, their sense levels go down. But I sometimes find that no matter how long we go,
Yep.
they're not down low enough, and, it's a concern, because then they go out and, they're still not very grounded. I mean, obviously I use other tools to help them.
Yeah.
But it's still, a lot of them don't ever, they're still 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Maybe they started at 9.
Right.
They're still not, grounded, so your sense is still pretty high. I just want to know how you have any special kinds of
Mhm.
things.
Yeah, so the question was if your client is dissociative and you're doing brain spotting, it's going well, they're going from a 9 to a 5 or 4, but they still can't get past that and get down to the 0. What's that about, and is there anything that we can do about that? And so I do talk about that. Again, if I don't hit everything that you wanted, just at the end, ask the question. So, great question. Anybody else have anything? Cool. So we'll get started. Basically, I didn't know how to really set this up. I wasn't sure exactly. I teach to my students a lot, but dissociation, complex trauma, regular PTSD stuff. but this seems to be a little bit different, and my colleagues that are doing brain spotting have been out in the field for a while. Maybe they have different questions, and so I actually asked my colleagues on the board what questions should I answer. What questions do you have? And so I'm going to start each slide with a question, sometimes a continued question. And then I'll try to answer it the best that I can. And again, we'll have a question and answer time at the end if you have more questions about it.
Hey John.
Yeah.
Can I just time out?
Yeah.
In Minnesota, do they have printouts of this? They do. Okay. Because I think probably when you turn your head to read it off of that, and I guess.
All right, I'm going to read it off of that then.
Okay. Okay.
So I'll come back to you guys. Yeah. Oh, yeah. One more.
So obviously there's a printout that I didn't catch. So
It was an email
Right.
that you could print out.
Yes,
So.
it was an email that I sent out last night, and I apologize. Josh sent it to United. So, I sent it out last night. If you did not get it, it's very likely that I mistyped your email address. So just check and let me know. Okay.
Okay, cool. So first question, obviously, what is dissociation? And so, again, these are questions that were asked by my colleagues on the board. And so the best quote that I came up with that I found, I got it from my supervisor, Rick Hoffler, is dissociation is what a mind does when it needs to hide from itself. And that's kind of ethereal. It's kind of, woo-woo, but it's also very pointed. It's saying, your mind is so overwhelmed by something that it has to hide from itself. It can't look at those things that are already there in the mind. And so that's what dissociation is. It's that way of hiding from those overwhelming feelings and thoughts. And so we'll get into all of those things, but that's kind of a general description. And so, this is kind of nerd stuff as far as dissociation goes, and I apologize if it's too wonky or too much information, but I tried to get as much information as I could and put it in a format that was helpful. So there's actually a couple of different theories about dissociation in the literature. If you go to the International Association for Dissociation and Trauma, you'll find that there's kind of two schools of thought. One school of thought says it's process-oriented. And process-oriented means that your brain is always trying to select from the most important things in your environment. And so our subconscious is always kind of looking at our environment and checking for the most important things. And when we're traumatized, that process gets hijacked because now it's looking for the things that might harm us. And so that's one way that process gets hijacked. And so when that system gets triggered and it gets overwhelmed because of those traumas, then we need to come in and slow some of that down. We need to hide from it. We need to regulate it. And we do that through dissociation. So that's one idea of how dissociation is working. The other school of thought is structural. And so structural dissociation is there's a split in the mind. And in those splits, those become very focused on particular issues, just kind of like I was saying as far as the process. And then those become actually self-referential, which means they feel like they're their own selves, that they're a different part and not the main part of you. And so, and it's structural in nature where it always goes back to those same ideas. And the easiest example is an alter. So, or an ego state. And so there's kind of two schools of thoughts. What ends up happening is it doesn't matter which school of thought that you come from. Both of them can be good descriptions of what's happening in dissociation, and you treat them just the same. So that's the good thing. You don't have to worry about that too much. And you probably weren't worried about it until I told you there was two schools of thought. So I apologize again if there's too much information. But the way that I usually think about dissociation is kind of on a continuum. So we have everything from spacing out, just kind of staring off into space, to, numbness, more things that we can feel in the body, those feelings of numbness, all the way to an ego state where you're kind of feeling differently, but you're not losing time. And you might be maybe even talking a little bit differently, but again, there's no amnesia between that part of you and the other parts of you. And then all the way to alter, where we have an alternate personality. You lose time when that alter is out. and it's kind of more extreme version of dissociation. And again, your brain and your mind are selecting these options based on your level of stress and your level of overwhelm. So that's what dissociation is. A little bit more, I have my consultant that I work with, Dr. Hoffler, and he said, make sure that you, so I asked him, what should I say in this program? And he said, make sure you go over the 5 cardinal signs of dissociation, so, and symptoms. So these are the things that we probably already learned in school, and so I won't, spend too much time on them, but it's depersonalization, it's that feeling of maybe being detached from yourself in different ways. Derealization, where you're kind of feeling like the world isn't real. David after dentist, is this the real world? It's kind of foggy, or you just might feel like the world is kind of flat. It's kind of black and white. There's nothing really going on in the world. It's not interesting to you at all. And then, of course, amnesia is if we're having different parts that are not remembering what's going on, or we have several different parts and they don't know about each other. We have amnesia between them. And then identity confusion is it's kind of a weird one to nail down, but it's kind of like when somebody feels a certain way about an important topic and then they feel completely different, and then they do something based on the way they're feeling at the time, and then they go back later and say, why did I do that? Like I just wasn't myself. They think that smoking is terrible for them or whatever, and then they go to the bar and they whip out a cigarette, and they're smoking that. Why were they smoking? Like, I hate smoking. It's terrible for me. But I just had this feeling like I needed to do it when I went to the bar. And so it's that kind of identity confusion stuff. And then the last one is identity alteration. That's DID. You're having a separate alternative personality to your regular personality. And so those are the 5 signs of dissociation. That's what we're looking for. And we'll go through kind of the smaller signs of that a little bit later on, so you know what to look for in your sessions as far as if your client is dissociating or not. If there are any questions as we're going on, if you want to pop up your hand, that's fine. We will have question and answer at the end, but if you have questions, as you want. Cool. So the next question that my colleagues asked me was, why do we dissociate? And so this is from my guy that I consult with, and he says to modulate overwhelming affect and to modulate images that come into our mind, thoughts and sensations in the body by separating from our felt experience. So we can't feel those overwhelming feelings. We hate that sense in our stomach that, we have butterflies or whatever, so we have to push that away, or that terror that we feel, we have to numb that out. And so we have those numbing sensations. And so that's why it's to kind of regulate those emotions so that we can function. We have to go through our daily lives and do things. We have to work, we have to go to school and all those things. And we can't do that if we're overwhelmed by our traumatic experiences constantly. So our brains have this lovely thing that it does for us, and we dissociate so we can function. All right. Okay, so what happens in the brain when we dissociate? That?
Have you had any chance when you were going to do some of this research? One of the questions I've been kind of wondering in terms of more specifically where in the brain is these kind of modulation occurring? Did you see anything in the research that helped you to kind of point that out?
Yeah. So yeah, definitely. Orbital frontal cortex is where we get overregulated, where it overregulates emotions. And so the insula is where they've seen on brain scans where if somebody switches from one alter to the other, the pathway to the body is through that insula, and different parts of the insula will light up with different alters. Yep. So there's several different constructs. Obviously, the amygdala is involved, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Yep. So there's lots of brain structures that are involved that the research is talking about. Yeah. So it's if we said all of them, we'd be here forever probably. But yeah, so there's a lot involved, and this next slide here is kind of what happens in the brain when we dissociate. So I answer some questions there. So there's 2 different types of dissociation, not 2 different theories of dissociation, but 2 different actual types of dissociation that the literature and people who are involved in studying dissociation have described. And so one is more survival based, and that's the peritraumatic dissociation, where the trauma is happening and stuff in your body is dissociating, your brain is dissociating in the moment of trauma. And so Robert Scaer he works with people. He started working out with people with whiplash, and then he found out that trauma is actually carried in the body. And so through his work with whiplash patients, he realized that. And so he started looking for more about trauma and dissociation. He kind of came up with this great example or construct for us called the dissociation capsule or dissociative capsule. And so in the trauma, in the peri-traumatic dissociation, what happens is we have a release of stress hormones. Of course, that's the fight-flight response, right? We are gearing up to either fight or run. And we have the autonomic response, which is those bodily sensations that come up. That's what we're finding when we're doing brain spotting. And so those bodily sensations are popping up. That's pain, it could be tenseness, it could be, just that feeling of the blood rushing away from our stomach, lots of different sensations. Distorted perception, so that comes from that flood of endorphins that comes when we're traumatized. And so we have numbing, we have cognitive impairment, we have detachment, we have a recall distortion. So when somebody says, this is what happened in the trauma, and there's somebody that was actually there as well, they say, well, that's not how it happened at all. Well, that doesn't matter actually, because the way the brain was distorted in that moment is what the recall is going to be. And so that's all that really matters when they're doing the processing, not what actually happened. So all of those symptoms come from this peri-traumatic dissociation. Amygdala, we call it the dragon because we have to tame the dragon to be able to do our processing, right? The amygdala gets activated, the fear, the terror, the rage come up, that rage that we have to push down and because we're afraid of that. And then the reptilian brain or the dorsal vagal parasympathetic nervous system sends the freeze signal. It decreases our blood pressure, it slows down our breathing, it decreases our heart rate, and so it has a physical effect on the body to calm it down because we're too amped up in the fight-flight response. But because it kind of over-regulates us, we go into kind of a freeze state. And then that memory that we have, all of these different symptoms and the thoughts that we're having kind of get broken up into these implicit memories. They're just little chunks of memories that are kind of floating around in our brain, not a coherent narrative that we normally have with typical things that happen to us in our lives, and they don't have any timestamp. So your brain always believes that it's back then instead of today. And so that's one of the main, issues with trauma is that your brain still feels like you're 9 years old and you're, 40 something. And so all of those things happen. They're all in this dissociative capsule, and all of that stuff gets frozen in time during the trauma. And that's a type of dissociation. It's experiencing non-reality in that moment. You're not experiencing the fullness of the reality of the moment. Even though your brain thinks that it definitely is experiencing the reality of it, it's kind of doing all these different things to try to help you in that moment to survive. Again, it's survival based. And then in DID, each alter can actually have its own dissociative capsule, because when that alter is present, when that specific type of trauma is happening, it has its own way of dealing with it. And so it might be the pain one, it's holding on to all the pain. And so it has the orientation of pain, that's what it's feeling in the body. So in, like I said, those brain scans with DID people, that's why different parts of the insula are actually lit up, because this one's about pain, this one's about numbness, this one's about terror, whatever it is. So each one of those can have their own dissociation capsule, and because of those presentations of the different hormones and different things like that, they can actually come up with their own diseases. So the apparently normal personality, which we'll kind of talk about why we call it that in a minute, can have diabetes, and one of the alters might not have diabetes, but it's not real. It's not a physical. It's not a medical difference. It's just a physical difference in the moment because of the way the body is reacting to whatever you're triggered by. And so that's kind of nerd stuff too. It's not really necessary to know over time. It's just in those moments when the alter is out.
So you're saying that for one event, someone who has, say, 3 parts might have 3 different trauma capsules?
That's correct. Because each of those alters might be coming in at different periods based on whatever they need to do for that trauma. So the question was, if they have 3 different alters, can each of those alters have a different dissociation capsule for that trauma? And that usually is the case, because they all have a different function. All the alters are doing something different for the person. Yeah.
Worked with the DID client once, and I still have a problem wrapping my head around this, that one part was drunk
Oh, yes.
and the others were not.
Absolutely.
And
I have a hard time wrapping my head around it.
Yeah, I have the exact same thing. So Deb had a question or a statement saying that she had one person with DID and one part was always drunk. And so when that part would be out, they would be presenting as drunk. And so again, it goes back to the neurochemicals.
They were actually drunk. I mean, they were drunk. They had spent a fair amount of time that day drinking. And so that part was drunk.
Okay.
The other parts were not.
Okay.
That could show it themselves.
Okay.
So that's the part. So that's the part I struggled with because, okay, so let's say they're driving.
Yeah.
And they're in that drunk
Right.
state.
Right.
And if they're not in the drunk state, will the bodies still have that, the chemical in it to be classified drunk?
Yeah. That's really interesting. It's kind of a technical thing, like will they blow a
And so
point eight or whatever.
Yeah, that's the part I just have a hard time wrapping my head.
Yeah. So what's the biggest concern about working with somebody like that?
I guess their state. I'm making this as a comment because it was hard for me to wrap my head around how somebody could be physically drunk and show part of them as drunk.
Yeah.
They are drunk, yes.
Yeah.
And other parts were not.
Yeah. So that goes back to all these neurochemicals that get flooded in the brain. So if you go into a different part that didn't have any of that going on, that part's going to shut down all the rest of those receptors or whatever it is. So they're going to have a completely different experience. So whatever's out is what's having the experience. It's not what the body does, because if you can go from one disease to another, the body doesn't care, right? It's just the presentation of whatever that alter state is. Yeah. Very weird. I have a client that has that same thing, but she actually is not drunk, but will present as drunk when she's in that state. Yeah. Yeah. It's very, dissociation, again, one of the next slides is dissociation is weird. And that's something that we have to kind of, realize that we're going to see a lot of odd stuff when we're talking about dissociation. Cool. All right. So, what happens in the brain still? So then the other type of dissociation, so we have the peritraumatic dissociation, which is what's happening in the trauma, and then we have structural dissociation, which would be kind of a functionality-based dissociation. So that's what happens after the traumas. During the traumas, it's collecting all that information, but the brain is doing something as well. The mind is doing something and creating these different ego states and alters to be able to help you get through those traumas and to get through life to be functional. And so that's that more structural dissociation. So the brain creates dissociative behaviors, ego states, personalities to be able to preserve the self, the apparently normal personality. So in the brain, it's kind of described in the literature that we have these silos that kind of go, some people call them columns from the top of the brain that kind of go down to the lower brain. And each of those silos is one of those ego states that kind of gets developed. That neural network gets used over and over and over again when we're traumatized. And so if something gets overused in our brains, it gets really good at doing that, and it gets kind of strong. And so those neural networks become kind of columns, and they become what they call siloed, and they become separated from each other. And they need to separate from each other because if their experiences are blended, then they're feeling all that stuff at the same time. The point is to dissociate that stuff out and to not feel it all at the same time. So just have one alter at a time that's coming out, or have them all be at the back and have the apparently normal personality out front to be functional. And so because of that overuse, those parts of the brain become siloed. You can think about that, the idea of a silo, it's just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, right? It's by itself, and so that kind of mirrors the idea that when we're in trauma, we're alone. And that's the reason why we get traumatized, because nobody is there to be a witness to us, to be a caretaker for us in that moment. We're alone in the trauma. And so those silos kind of mirror that aloneness, and then those become those ego states and altered personality states. So again, some of this is more kind of nerd stuff, but extra information for you. All right. So the last thing about what happens in the brain. So our brain has the ability to create so many different ways to dissociate. It's amazing. And so we can do anything from creating opioids to numb ourselves. We have natural opioids that happen in the brain. That's why people cut, so they can actually get that opioid process going. And so we can have visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, anything that's going to kind of distract us from those feelings and thoughts. And sometimes they exacerbate them, but sometimes they just kind of get us away from those feelings. And what I tell my students is the number of ways that you can dissociate is the number of people on the earth, which and then more nerd stuff is 7.46 billion people on the earth, times the amount of ideas that a brain can come up with, that a mind can come up with to dissociate. So that's as many ways probably as able to dissociate, which is mind-boggling, right? It's too much. And that's why dissociation is so weird, because depending on what the person's experience is, what their culture is, all of these things matter. What movies they've seen, all that stuff matters. And because I have people have alters that are a comic book character from their favorite comic, right? And that's what helps them the most. And so all of those different ways can be ways that people dissociate. So we just have to figure out, how they're doing that, what their presentations are, and not worry about, hey, you're not meeting this criteria, you're not following exactly the way my other clients are doing it, because it can be completely different. And so we want to keep an open mind about that. So asking you guys questions, and you guys in Minnesota as well, what dissociative symptoms have you seen in your clients? So we see somebody who's drunk and not drunk in presentations. What kind of interesting stuff have you guys seen? Sure.
Last night I was doing a brain spotting session with someone, and he went to a different lifetime.
Wow.
It was not in the present.
Yeah.
It was a different lifetime. This is a white man, but he was in a black body.
Okay. Wow.
And was experiencing extreme sadness.
Okay.
And I think what brought him out of this was asking me if I was with him and did I understand. He was having a lot of pain on one side.
Okay.
And like when he heard my voice and numbness, the numbness went out.
Okay.
And he was able to come around.
Okay.
So it was that really attuning that helped. But, and this happened last year with another client too. We're doing EMDR because I didn't know brain spotting. She saw her death from a past life.
Okay. Wow.
So those kind of things are.
Yeah. So Terry in the audience said that she just had a client last night and had one last year that had the experience of being in a past life. So they were a particular race in this life, and they're a different one. They just had a different body, and they felt differently, and so they had that experience. And she had 2 different clients that had that experience. That's yeah.
Childlike behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
5-year-olds, 3-year-olds.
Yeah. Childlike
And
voices and
at the
things,
same
right?
time, they go to teenager and they're very defensive.
Yeah. I always love the teenagers. They really get in there. They have a lot of opinions.
They're so mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As we know, working with teenagers, and then you have an alto that's a teenager. Great. Yeah. Good.
I have one that does the very same visual kinds of things. He's walking down this hallway, and there's locked doors, and there's lights, and that's kind of like not unnerving, but I don't know what to do with that.
Okay. Are they in a flashback, or are they having a hallucination?
Well, it's during brain spotting.
Oh, okay.
So, I just figured it's his own personal journey.
Yeah.
And whatever he takes from that is what it is.
Yeah.
But,
So kind of experiencing a hallucination of walking down a different hallway with different kind of lights and things like that while they're doing brain spotting. That's interesting.
I think we worked together on this. No, I don't know if we worked together in this case, but up at New Wilderness when we worked there. So a child that was horribly traumatized in South American country, and so different animals. So there was different animals inside. So
Yes, we did work on
there
the
was
same one.
9 different animals.
Yep.
So there's lion, tiger, bear. So literally, it would be different animal states right in front of each other.
Yeah.
So it'd be working with a tiger, and brainstorming with a tiger, and then we flip into like brainstorming with a lion, right? You know,
Yeah.
it's amazing transformation.
Yeah. Absolutely, and there was also a 5-year-old part
That's
as well.
right,
That I believe you experienced pretty well. Yeah, so we Jeff and I shared a client from New Vision Wilderness where they would be in different animal states. So each part was a different kind of animal. So you were, he said you were doing brain spotting with tiger, and then you were doing brain spotting with bear. That's really interesting presentation. Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about her in a second and tell you what happened with the animals.
I had one when I was super new to even the idea of dissociation, and he was a teenage male. But once in a while, I would act like a pirate and be really like giddy about it. And I remember going back to our supervisor, and I'm like, "Is there a pirate in there?" And he's like, "No, he's like, that's a kid. He's messing with you. He's not a pirate." But yeah, I had a young kid alter.
Yeah. So a young kid alter that was acting like a pirate
Yes.
during sessions. Yes. Good. Great. So again, 7.46 billion times the number of ideas that we can have is how you might see dissociation. So don't be surprised by anything, really. Okay. So next question that I got from my colleagues was, how is dissociation adaptive, protective, performance enhancing, and helpful? My thought about this before we start is dissociation to me isn't really a disease. I don't even know if it's a disorder, because if you think about it, if you're traumatized every day of your life, it's probably the most orderly thing that your brain can do to help you out in this way, to take you away from those experiences, to help you to be functional. And so, it's very adaptive just by its nature of helping you to be able to tolerate your environment, to be able to be successful and go forward with your life, at least part of your life, by managing those emotions and thoughts and sensations. It's adaptive and protective by regulating those overwhelming feelings. So it's protecting you from your apparently normal personality, from all of those negative influences in your environment. It can enhance performance by kind of deleting all of the extraneous information in your environment and getting you into a kind of a zone state. Some people say it's flow. They say golfers get into the flow or whatever, and that can be hypnotic, but it can also be dissociative, and sometimes there's overlap between those two. And so your dissociative mind can help you to be focused on your work for the moment instead of being focused on all those traumatic incidents, and so it is very performance enhancing in a way. And it's helpful because of all those reasons. So my question for you guys is, how has dissociation been helpful for you or your clients? Is there anybody that had somebody who was like a high-level performer in life, but also had a lot of dissociative stuff going on in the back?
Well, I would say that almost all my clients, they are mothers, fathers, they have jobs, they, perform, they do so many things, in life.
Yeah.
But they are so dissociated.
Yeah. So even though it's not what we consider like out there, we're high performers doing our regular daily stuff, right? It's hard to be a parent, and it's hard to do our job sometimes, and we have that dissociation to help us to be able to focus and do that. So yeah.
Well, I work with a very specific population who are involved in sex trade either by choice or by force.
Yeah.
And so in order to get through, a lot of them use dissociation as a way to numb out from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a member in the audience, Manibu, said that she works with sex trafficked workers, and so they dissociate to kind of be able to handle those situations. Absolutely. So it is very protective. It's very performance enhancing. It's very helpful to us. That's why it exists. Yeah, thank goodness for for dissociation. Yay, dissociation.
And that's actually how I say it. I'm like, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
In order to
Thank
get through
goodness.
this, you have to.
Right, definitely. So another question is, since it's so helpful, then why should we treat it? Why are we sitting here learning about dissociation to treat it when it's so helpful?
Yeah, and thank you say that because I remember when I started to work in trauma, I remember some teachers, were telling me, oh, it's terrible that you allow your client to dissociate in your session.
Right.
Oh no, your client is falling asleep. That's terrible, So
Yeah.
I was like, oh my god, like my client cannot dissociate,
No.
So I was and maybe I was projecting my anxiety also to the client.
Yeah, absolutely. So, somebody had a supervisor that was saying, why do you let your clients dissociate in sessions? And so she became freaked out by that, thinking maybe she was doing something wrong, but absolutely not. Yeah, Jeff.
Well, I mean, adaptations are great, but they're also time specific and kind of need to evolve out, right? So,
Yeah.
So I might suck my thumb when I'm 7, and that's my dissociative adaptation to that time.
Mhm.
It's not really kind of the best thing to be doing at 46 as a professional, right? So,
Yep.
So to me, it's about just helping the system to readapt to kind of more effective strategies. Because many times I'm away from those traumas, and I don't need to be using those adaptations currently to survive.
Yeah, so it's because, the answer to that question, Jeff pointed out very well, is that some of those adaptations that we have that were helpful for us back then aren't necessary now. We need other adaptations that are more healthy now. And, another, reason I came up with was because we can. Right now that we know how to get to those traumas, to process them, we could do that for those people, and so they don't have to dissociate, so they can feel more integrated, more part of their experience instead of being so fragmented.
Yeah, I had a client who talks,
Mhm.
and she is adamant that this is good for her.
Yeah.
And that there's no reason not to do it.
Right.
It's not hurting anyone else.
Yeah.
She enjoys the release from it,
Mhm.
and it's really hard for me to kind of not agree with her.
Yeah. Yeah, so-
I understand that's.
So self-harm is a huge thing for dissociative people, and so when from the outside, people are like, "Oh no, she's cutting," and there's blood and all that kind of stuff. But they feel like it's really helpful for them.
Yeah, and she actually gets ticked off when we talk about trying to do something else.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but the point of it is that it's also not really great for her to have these cuts on her arm and all those consequences for that. So if we can get to the traumas, if we can process through the dissociative process, then she doesn't have to use that as an adaptation. And so she can use something else. Right now, that's what she's using, and that's got to be okay for right now, but later on, we can have her adapt to something else. Yeah.
Are we really treating the dissociation, or are we treating the underlying issue that causes us to dissociate?
The underlying
Okay,
issue.
so in terms of this, I guess the question is,
Yes, thank you for the semantic lesson. I appreciate it. You should have been there when I was editing. No, you're right. Devin brought up that the way I asked the question, it sounds like, are we just treating dissociation? We're really eventually treating the traumas, but we're doing it through the dissociative process. So that's a good way, better way to ask the question. But, yeah.
What I also have found is that when clients dissociate during sessions, especially with people who have complex PTSD, you could be doing this work over and over again, and they forget. It's like that part of the session is erased.
Yeah.
And they come back and it took me a while to get that.
Yeah. So sometimes when we're working with clients, one part of them will actually process through and it'll be great, but then another part will come back and not have any recollection that you actually did the work. Yeah. So I would like to take everybody's things, but we do have to move through. There are 30 slides. So I want to make sure we get to it. Write your questions down, please. If you still have it at the end, definitely let me know. Okay. So the next question was, I thought it's a great question. What do I need to know about dissociation to be a better counselor? And so, that's what we're here for. We're trying to strive and be better counselors. And I definitely am. I'm always doing reading and learning and trying to work with clients in different ways. So, the best thing that I've kind of already said is, to be a better counselor when you're working with dissociation is just to know that it's okay Dissociation's okay. You shouldn't be afraid of it or stop your clients from dissociating necessarily. There's different times that we will do that, but it's helpful. It's weird. We've talked about before, and it's amazing. So if you have all that in your context of looking at dissociation, and basically that just tells you like it's all right. They're here. They're presenting the dissociation to you, which is great. Some of them, the AMP will be out and you won't see any of that stuff. I've had clients like that. I worked with a client for a year or something, a year and a half, and had no idea that there was stuff behind there until we actually took a break from therapy and then I came back, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So it's good that they're presenting it. It's okay that it's there and we can do something about it. The more you learn about dissociation, the better. So do all of your reading, do trainings, get consultation. You'll just be more comfortable with it and you'll know what to do with it. So when it presents to you, you'll be like, okay, we're on the road. Let's do it. Be curious about it, just like we are with brain spottings. Use that no assumptions model because there's 7.46 billion, times whatever ways to dissociate. Just be curious about what's being presented to you. If you have a client that it seems weird and you're not quite sure what's going on with them, the first thought is always dissociation. Something's going on there. There's parts of them that are affecting me and I'm being thrown off my game because there's something going on and then they're thrown off theirs. And so I usually think about that when that's happening, is there's probably dissociation there. And let's see. So what you want to do, again, figure out which styles of dissociation they're using, or try to identify it as much as you can, and then use your skills and knowledge that you've been trained with and start working with them. Dissociation seems, to some people like it's overwhelming or it's bad, but it's actually the way through which you're going to be able to help them process those traumas. It's the medium that we're using to get to those parts, to get to the traumas. And so it's okay. It's actually helpful for us in a way to be able to get to what they really are there for. And then, of course, do your own work. If you have traumas in your life, you're dissociative, your clients can definitely trigger you. And so do your own work, stay grounded, definitely get training and consultation and learn as much as you can and take care of yourself. I've had clients come in who were therapists and they're working with DID clients and they're secondarily traumatized by it. They're too stressed out by working with 8 different people from one, 8 different personalities from one person and all these different personalities, emailing and calling and all that stuff. It's stressful. It can be. And so when you're working with this population, you want to take care of yourself and definitely know as much as you can. So, let's see. How do I talk to my clients about dissociation? That was the next question that I got. So, of course, different parts are in different developmental stages, and different clients come in at different developmental stages. So you want to be developmentally appropriate with the person. But you also want to be comfortable with your own way of describing dissociation. So you want to kind of have something in your back pocket of, okay, I'm seeing these signs, and this is what I think, this is what some people go through when they've had traumas, and just kind of describe it in your own way, what dissociation is, kind of using these terms that we've been talking about, but to the developmental level of the person. You want to describe, when somebody's super traumatized, as our dissociative clients are, why knowing those things can be so terrifying, and why the mind helps you when knowing that stuff is too terrible for you to think about. And then one way to have start a really good discussion is just do a DES, just get the dissociative experiences scale, do the SKID, the MID, the DDIS, whatever you want to do an assessment. And then those questions will actually spark other questions from the client, and then you can kind of describe, how in the DES it's, or you ask me this question about if I feel like a different person sometimes. So what's that about? Oh, great question. And then we can go on with the topic of dissociation and get them kind of used to it. So I have a couple of funny pictures up here. You can't really see the top of them, but it's tag team wrestler, ladies, and then Beavis and Butthead. So I have those up. Well, with my adult clients, generally they know who Beavis and Butthead are. And so I could give that as a description because it's kind of funny. So I usually say something like, we all have different parts of ourselves. Every single person does. It's not that they're dissociated, it's just that we have different neural networks that kind of fire at different times. And so if I'm in teacher mode right now, I'm accessing all the information about dissociation and trauma that I need to, and kind of how to talk to people who are learning. And so that part of me is the teacher part of me is online right now. But if I usually say this in class at school, so this is a weird thing because my wife is actually here. But if my wife were to call me, which would be very strange, and say there's something going on with our 4-year-old, what should we do? All of the network that is online for my wife, first of all, comes online, and about my kids, and information of what do we do in a crisis situation. All that kind of comes online. My teacher mode is not there anymore, but that part of me comes online. And then if I put down the phone and my best friend from high school calls me, and starts talking, you might start hearing me talk like Beavis and Butthead, because we spent college together and we always watched the marathons, and so we would just talk like that still. That's kind of imprinted in my brain. That's how I talk to my friend Ron, right? So that neural network is online, but those neural networks can be switched very easily, and they can communicate with each other. I can have my wife and my friend on the phone probably at the same time and kind of talking to them back and forth, no problem, right? My brain is pretty integrated, hopefully, But in dissociation, those parts of ourselves become fragmented. They become siloed, like we talked about before, and so they start to operate a little bit on their own. So, when those traumas are happening and those neural networks are overused, those start to split off a little bit just to protect you from the information that they're holding on to. And so then we get the tag teams. So we have the tag team wrestlers here. One of my clients felt that she was like a big arena with a wrestling ring in the middle, and there was different parts of her tag teaming out depending on what the situation was. And that's how she kind of visualized her different parts working, which was great. And so you kind of talk about that. When we have this particular situation, this part of us needs to come in. When we're having this, this part of us needs to come in, and kind of discussing it like that. For kids, we could talk about metaphors like being animals, being characters, cartoon characters, different things like that. And then, this part of you is the angry, tiger. And then this part of you is the cuddly bear, and all of those kinds of things. So we kind of can help them put into context, but we want them to put it in their own context if they have it. But we can kind of talk about those different ideas. So any questions about that, like how you would talk to somebody about dissociation? Just framing it however you think that they would be able to handle it, and having your own kind of ways that you talk about it really helps. How many times I pull out the Beavis and Butthead in your class, right? In your class, right? So it really helps to have that in my back pocket. People get it. Okay. What if my client is afraid of dissociation? They should be. That's a natural response, because dissociation is very weird. It's not a normal thing in everyday life. People don't know what it is. And so they should probably have a natural inclination to be like, oh, really? I have different parts inside of me, and they're coming out and, behaving differently. So that's natural. And so I say that's a natural process to be afraid of dissociation, and kind of normalize that for them. And then also just normalizing the idea that our brains need to hide from themselves, and that's the way that our brains do it. Thank goodness, is through that dissociation to help us with that fear. You want to definitely work on your therapeutic relationship, both for getting to those parts that you're going to be working with, and also to do brain spotting. Obviously, there's a relational aspect to it, so that's really important to work on that therapeutic process. When you do that, they're going to have more trust in you, and then they're going to be able to understand that you're not messing with them. You're not trying to say, no, you're this or that, or you have these different parts, and they're going to be more willing to kind of listen and understand that you're trying to work with them and help them. And those different parts are going to be more willing to trust as well. Jeff?
So I think that phobic piece is so important, and I think it's a piece that's not. When I picked up on that and learned it from Kathleen Martin, she really helped me understand it in terms of, I think of the capsule as basically the kind of protective barrier of the capsule is the phobic response. Mm-hmm. And so it's like this, I always use the example of, the cloaking device for Klingons in miniatures. Yeah. So that's that phobic. So don't go near it, or they're repelling kind of two magnets, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really natural. And part of the process of working with dissociation is learning to work with that phobic response and work in that, kind of medium.
Yeah. And the phobia goes both ways, right? It's the part that's afraid that you're going to see it, and it's also you're afraid to see the part.
Exactly.
It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Great point. So one thing that will help them, your clients, to be able to tolerate the idea of dissociation is to do kind of preliminary work. So working with containers, having them be able to use affect containers, memory containers, so that they can see that they have control over some of this material. And when they feel like they have control over it, they're not as afraid of it. And so when you can go from containers to, parts, that's a pretty easy transition. They can understand that there's stuff going on inside them that they can manipulate and have some interaction with it and have some control over. So that's also a helpful thing. You definitely want to work with those types of things that, the rheostat, that dial that we could put have them visualize internally to turn up a feeling and turn down a feeling. That's really helpful to have them have some self-control, of those emotions, and they get more comfortable with that idea. We want to go as slowly as the client needs to. I have a client right now that I've been seeing for over 5 years, and every once in a while we'll try to do some stuff with parts, and she's super phobic about it. She said several times, I don't want to be crazy. And that's the perception, that if you have dissociative parts, that you're crazy. And so, looking at all of the rest of the stuff that's going on in her mind, she's worried about these parts actually helping her. It's very odd, but that fear really is there. And so, over these past 5 years, trying to slowly work up to the idea of working with at least thought processes that are different, that get triggered, and those thought processes can turn into parts work eventually. And so just slowly going as slow as the person needs to, and building that rapport up with them is really helpful. Has anybody here had any breakthroughs in working with somebody who's phobic of the dissociation? Yeah, Jerry.
I worked with this woman for about 5 years, and she was so scared, because there were certain times of the year that she had anniversaries of when her father abused her, like when it would snow and it would be snowing outside and she'd get scared. I don't know. I did a lot of parts work with her, internal family systems work with her. And she finally turned the corner. I thought she was going to be with me for but she has been out of therapy now for 2 years.
Great.
And she checks in with me every once in a while, and I'm okay.
So did she have a specific internal part that helped her feel more confident or less afraid, that was helpful to her? Or?
Well, in working with internal family systems, we work with the idea of higher self.
Yeah.
And she was eventually able to do that, because I think people who are traumatized aren't able to give themselves compassion oftentimes. But she was finally able to get to that place and help that little girl out of those memories.
Okay.
And just help them get out of there, and then offer them support and help.
Yeah.
And we did that enough over and over and over and over again, several times that it finally.
Yeah. So finding an internal place of strength to be able to help you go through those difficult periods of time is really helpful.
Yeah. I had a client who I've been working with her for 2 years, and every time she came to session, I thought we were making progress, and then that part that came to session had no memory, and we were back to but when she was getting defensive, and when I was noticing all those parts and what was going on with her, I became an ally of her protectors.
Oh, great.
So becoming an ally, becoming a friend. You're okay with me? What are you doing? How old are you? So becoming a friend and making the protectors feel safe. She started to go back into those memories of not having the perfect childhood that she imagined.
Okay. Yeah.
That she thought she had. And I've been doing Brainspotting with her for pretty much every session that we have now, and she's made huge progress because she's okay with letting her body and being okay and safe in the space.
Yeah.
So she was, but it took a while to be friends for 2 hours.
Yeah.
2
So-
years. 2 years to be friends.
Yeah. So in this case, there were parts that were presenting to you, and you became friends with them, so that the whole system would feel comfortable, so you could actually do the work that you need to do. Right. Cool. So let's.
Can I share something? too?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, when I initially started doing parts work, I'd have these clients that would come in would be pretty suicidal.
Yeah.
And, was afraid of all that. No, I don't know of any therapist initially when you're a newbie isn't afraid of their client, killing themselves. But listening to David and about the parts work and stuff like that, like it going after it. So instead of being in fear of it, I had one client, it was a 5-year-old. She was heavy set and was bullied a lot in school. And so we processed 6 sessions straight just on all of those bully experiences and these imagery that she wanted to die and holding the space and everything like that. And she doesn't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So that was like, okay, I'm sold. So
Yeah.
now I try to do that, especially if I have clients that come in that have, I'm not saying that's going to work for everyone, but for that one client, so I'm more inclined to go towards it now versus, making sure they're stable, of course, and they have resources and stuff, but I'm more apt to go toward it because it may be a part that is struggling.
Yeah.
So.
And that suicidality, it really comes up with dissociative clients because it seems like a solution to all of this.
Yeah.
All of that stuff
So
that's
much
going on.
pain,
It's
yeah.
the only thing that's real sometimes in the world. So you'll get a lot of suicidality. Again, you go after it, you work with it,
Yeah.
you'll get the results. Cool. Okay. So I don't even know how much more we have left, but or how much time that we got here.
We have 20 more minutes and then we take our break.
Okay. Let's rush through. Okay. So what can I do if a client is dissociating was the next question I got from my colleagues. So I came up with my own joke about it. How do you know a traumatized client is dissociating? They showed up to your office.
Yeah.
That's the only way that most of our clients could actually get to an office is if they dissociate. So is my traumatized client dissociating? Yes. Most likely that's happening. But there are certain signs and symptoms that you can see in the session if you feel like their apparently normal personality came in. How can you tell if they might start to have a little bit of dissociation during your session? So let me go through some of these, and then if we have more, definitely let me know. So we have some kind of broken up speech. They're telling a story and then they kind of stop and kind of look around and their eyes kind of wobble and they can't really get out what they're saying. Stuttering, staring off into space. Is another thing, you'll be talking to them all of a sudden, just kind of one of those things. Being shut down. So, you have clients a lot, I get that with adolescent clients, they're just shut down, they don't want to say anything, they kind of huddle into themselves. It's definitely a sign of dissociation. Feeling numbness or pain if they're reporting that to you, that they have this weird pain sensation that just popped up. There's probably some dissociation going on there, some numbness. And then the Hulk is, those clients that we have that get really animated, get maybe aggressive, start saying, why are you asking me that? Or, if we're working with kids, they might be running out of the room or knocking stuff over or whatever. That's a dissociation probably happening. Then we got some eye rolls and eye wobbles you might see miscellaneously. We definitely see that when we're doing brain spotting, but that also happens. You might see the eyes kind of go back and glaze over a little bit. And then that's my picture for baby talk. So you might hear a voice tone change. You were talking about that. So, and I definitely have clients where their voice tone goes to a child of a higher pitch, lower level of vocabulary. Sleepiness, definitely. I had one client who got so sleepy, there was no reason for him to be sleepy. He came in, he was fine, everything was fine. We're talking about stuff, and all of a sudden he's like, he's kind of closing his eyes. He gets really sleepy. He fell asleep right on my couch, and I tried to wake him up, like, hey, how's it going? Trying to say his name, saying it louder, going over, chucking him on the shoulder a little bit. He would not wake up. His mom had to come in, and we had to kind of help him out to the car. It's because of this dissociation. So those opioids can come in and kind of help you get super sleepy, and that definitely happens. Tenseness in the body, just out of nowhere. Anything that pops up is probably dissociation or trauma related. If they're just sitting there and then something kind of enters in. And then kind of that disconnected feeling floating above myself, seeing myself from the corner of the room, different things like that. So if any of that stuff is reported to you, if you see any of this stuff happening or hearing this stuff happening, you're probably going to get some, they're probably dissociating in your office there. Did you have something extra to check?
Yeah, just you might want to clarify the term trigeminal part, just because for some people I don't know that they know that term.
I think it's next. So yeah, I'll do that in a second here. So when we talk about structural dissociation in a second, I'll talk about it. So if a client is displaying any signs of dissociation, you kind of have a couple of options. You can either help them get back to the room by using some kind of grounding technique, calling them back and saying, what are you noticing around the room? Look to the left or right. I use that orienting response. What do you see that you like in my office? Different things, have them describe that so that they're back present. Or you can actually explore that dissociation, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's probably going to be the most helpful thing for treatment-wise, is to actually explore it a little bit. Anybody using any good grounding techniques? We'll take one person who uses a really good grounding technique that helps kind of bring somebody back and get grounded.
The brainspotting technique, the grounding one that we learned recently, session, that's a real good one.
Which one?
It's like a resource spot, and then you have them touch the ground, their feet touch the ground.
Yeah.
And just feel the ground beneath you.
Right.
And see if that helps you feel grounded.
Yeah, press your heels into the ground. Yeah. So pressing your heels into the ground, finding a spot for that. If you want to find a resource spot for that. Good. Excellent. All right. What do we got next? So, so if you're going to explore the dissociation, what you can do is just start asking kind of gentle questions. What are you experiencing as far as your perceptions? Like, what are your thoughts that are going through your mind right now? What are the images that you're seeing? What are sensations that you're feeling in your body? How old do you feel? Do you feel like you're in the room? Do you feel like you're out of the room? Just kind of getting their ideas of what's happening, their perceptions of what's happening with them. Saying, I'm seeing some stuff going on. I'm just wondering what's going on with you right now. How are you feeling? How do you feel about me? That's a really good question, because they have different parts of them will have different perceptions of you as the therapist, your relationship. So that's really good information to know, because to work with those parts, they have to be willing to talk about how they're feeling about you. In some cases, that's helpful. So just those gentle questions, you can kind of explore that a little bit. Again, at the end, if you want to get them grounded and do those grounding techniques, that's great. So you want to see if the client, when you're exploring that, see if they have a visual perception in their mind's eye of what that is. And so, this is the picture here. Is it a 6-year-old part of themselves? Is it a monster? Is it something that you can see in their mind's eye that's associated with those sensations, thoughts, and feelings that are coming up? And then that can be an entryway to a part. And so then we can start doing some parts work possibly with that. So just kind of asking them those different kinds of varied questions really can help. And then creating a map of the client's dissociative ability. So, we do the mind's eye thing. They see this monster. And they say, okay, what's the monster about? How is the monster created? We start to figure out those different parts. With the client that we had, there's all these different animals, right, in the 5-year-old. Alter, actually, it seemed like it was a really dissociated ego state. And so we mapped that out. And what was really interesting with that client was, as soon as we mapped that out, as soon as literally I was finishing the end of the sentence and then going over all these different parts that this person had, and all the descriptions, the ages, when they were created, what they were holding on to, what their function was, how they helped in the past. We laid all of that stuff out kind of in the list format, went through the list with her, and all of a sudden she did this thing where she just kind of like moved her back kind of like that, and then she just goes like, I feel like whole or something, like I feel really different, like I'm not those things anymore, like they're just a part of me. Like I just realized, oh, those are just feelings I have, those are just memories I have, and they're just kind of a part of me. And never for the rest of the time that I've known her, and I knew her for a couple of years after that, and been in contact with her recently, has she ever gone back to feeling that those separate parts. That has never happened before. I know it's going to be super rare if that ever does happen, but just that understanding, for some reason, was able to pull all those parts in. And then we did lots of work after that with traumas and different things, but those parts apparently didn't need to be separated anymore. It was really interesting. And just doing that map really helped out with that situation. But I always map it. We always figure out, you know, who's who, what are their functions, all that's really helpful to get a landscape. What do you do if a client goes into a flashback? So the best thing you can do is to try to avoid flashbacks, and so you're using containers for some of those emotions. You're coming in and helping them kind of get grounded from the beginning so that you can work through stuff. But flashbacks happen, and so something that you can do is kind of you know, anything from just calling their name back to the room, kind of gently calling them back and having them notice and using the orienting response, kind of what I was saying before, to anything to an extreme version of saying, okay, you know, I know you can't see me right now, but I'm going to come through the door of the room wherever you're at right now, and I'm going to come in so fast that the perpetrators that are in the room, they won't be able to see me, and I'm going to grab you and I'm going to lead you out of the room. And, you know, 1, 2, 3, and then you go in and you know, they visualize being taken out of the room and back into the office or back into a safe place of some kind. You know, it can be as extreme as that. And so there's, you know, literature about it, different techniques that you can use, but helping that person to get out of that experience somehow by experiencing the room that they're in. That's what you want to get to. And then once they, again, experience the office, you want to get them like the orienting response. That's going to be helpful. Has anybody ever successfully gotten somebody out of a flashback rope with one person? Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, kind of similar thing that you experienced. And I actually found that it was the only way to fully kind of integrate the system. You had to go in through the flashback, into the system, to the actual, because the system was so protected, there was no way to get to this baby mark that was in the room that was all locked up, right? So it was almost like the system had to kind of go into that state in order to get in there to be able to come back. And had a similar experience after that in terms of, like we talked about with the girl that kind of had that shake off.
Yeah.
As soon as that happened, like literally the person's functionality went up and functioned almost for the rest of her life from that.
Wow. Okay.
So for me, it kind of like changed my perception of flashbacks. I don't really kind of like, I mean, they can be kind of re-traumatizing and really kind of like impact the overall fear for the client. So, you know, it can be really difficult for them to experience that, but it can also be this great moment of transformation if I can stay, you know, in alliance with the present somewhat, you know.
Yeah, and just so you're actually doing work as you're going into the flashback. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we don't think about it like that. We think flashback, get out, you know, kind of like here. Everybody will say that's scary, but we can actually do some good work with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, like doing the eye contact spot that we talk about.
Yeah.
Like just, there's been times because they won't let me in. They won't let you go in. So just holding the spot, using my voice and saying, you know, can you look at me? Can you look at me? And keep using that. So that island, we create that island where they're seeing me, they're still going through the flashback, but they see me in there. So I'm interrupting that neural biology from sticking to the way it used to be.
Yeah.
So that's what I use.
Yep. Perfect.
Can I say one more brainspotting thing?
Okay.
So I've found when I see a lot of clients that come in and have a really persistent gay spot that I think, you know, that I will, you know, see that as a gay spot, it's a dissociative flashback spot.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So really learning to kind of pick that up, it's a doorway and it's a persistent regulation of the system in some ways. You know, so when they get to a certain level, they just go into that flashing back and it regulates the system. And so being able to kind of go into that space and work with is so crucial because the system becomes, to me, seems like it's dependent upon that to kind of shut the system down.
Yeah.
And so learning to teach them awareness that they're like, oh, hey, here we're going in that kind of like, you know, can we kind of stay out over here or let's go in here for 5 seconds and then let's come back out.
Yeah. So again, more working with that flashback as it's coming up and the different aspects of it, having them be more aware of it, and using the brain spotting, especially during gaze spotting, that can be a flashback spot. So from Jeff in the audience, great. Okay. How to integrate brain spotting with dissociative class? Hey, we're talking about brain spotting. So the structural dissociation idea comes from Vanderhart and Lihus. I don't really know how to say his name. I apologize.
Good luck. I don't know.
But so what they're saying is that we have a functional neural network, a part that is out that's functional, and we call that the apparently normal personality. And so that's the part that interacts with the world. We call it the front part sometimes. And then we have emotional parts, EPs. So AMPs and EPs. And the EPs are those child parts that were created during those traumatic experiences. Those are the neural networks that were reinforced over and over again. And those are the parts that pop out when they're triggered into dissociation. So they can be caretakers, shame, rage, alters, introjects, which we'll talk about in a minute. And some of them might not even contain any of the trauma, but they're just there to protect, or they're there to nurture or do something for the client. And so that's Drew Barrymore as her apparently normal personality. And if anybody saw Firestarter when she was like 6, that would be her EP coming out. All right. So let's see, how much time we have before 10:30?
Yeah, 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of this ego state therapy. So, the structural association theory is a good way to conceptualize kind of what you're seeing. But ego state therapy is kind of where we're going to do a lot of the work. And again, there's lots of different ways to work with them. These are the ways I found to be helpful to work with my my clients' parts. But the disclaimer, I have to do a disclaimer. I promised the guy that I consult with, Rick, that I would do a disclaimer that I'm not teaching you how to do stuff today. That working with DIB clients and people who are dissociated can be very taxing on us and very overwhelming to us, and it can be very overwhelming to them. And you really want to know what you're doing when you're working with these clients. They're actually in kind of this suggestible state all the time. They're in a hypnotic state all the time, and so we want to make sure that what we're saying and doing is going to be helpful to them and kind of understand that process. And so, get your training and get consultation and, do your reading as much as you can. If you want to check out the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, they have a great website. You can do online trainings. So get all that information. I promised I would do that, so that's my disclaimer. Okay. So doing ego state therapy, when you're beginning with the parts work, you want to try to find what we call the snitch. So you want to find somebody that knows about the system, has some level of authority where they can kind of work with the other parts if possible, or at least a part that kind of knows a lot about the system. And so then we can kind of have access. This part does this part does this, or this part's not going to let you do that, or this part comes out to try to harm themselves. And so we want to find that part if they have that. And then once we find parts to work with, or in the process of finding parts, we want to use what we call workspace or conference room. You could call it either one, but and there's different ways that you can use a conference room. Basically, it's a space that you can get those parts together, or just one part, and then you can have a conversation, or you can have the apparently normal part have a conversation with that particular part to kind of work out what it needs to be able to process, to finally use brain spotting and to process what it's holding on to. So I've had clients that use the conference room idea. I love it because you have so many different things that you can use in the conference room. You have a video screen that you can bring memories up on, or you could that part can talk to you through the screen. You have a phone in the middle of the desk that you can get a call, or you can call out to a part. And you have several different chairs so they can come in and you can have a conversation with several different parts, or you can process with many different parts at the same time. It will often have, they can set it up themselves internally, so they have doors or windows, depending if they feel comfortable with that. One of my clients had a drop-down floor that went into a sub-compartment of his to do some more work down there, and where he could communicate with another part that wasn't willing to communicate with him. The way he could communicate with a part that wasn't willing to communicate with him in a regular conference room because there were other parts around. And then I have one client who uses a living room space, and because all of her parts are younger parts of herself. And so she was used to all those parts that did in this living room, so she created the living room for that. And then I've had parts that will be in the woods, or they'll have their own island that they go to, that they can do that specific work for. And then parts are behind trees or something, they'll call them out one at a time or whatever. So just whatever space that they can create internally that you can do this work, it's really helpful. It's not necessary. You can just talk through and do that work like that, but it's sometimes helpful for them to visualize those different parts and be able to visualize that connection between the two. So how to integrate brain spotting. One thing that we're going to do, I already talked about, was using containers. So we create these imaginal containers. They can be like a filing cabinet where they have a particular trauma that they can, kind of have on a sheet of paper and then put it in the filing cabinet, lock that away, and then they don't have to deal with that for a certain amount of time, either during processing or for the next week. So we can use containers in lots of different ways, for in session, for between sessions. And the more that you work with them, the better, because when I first started working with them, I tried it once and then it didn't work. And so I figured, well, it doesn't work with this person. But what I realized over time is that if you continue to try to do that, just do the in-session stuff in the beginning and then try to do between session stuff, that will really help them to be able to regulate, to stay focused. When those parts come out, you have to be able to put them into containers or tuck them away, or else they're going to be intrusive in that person's life, and we don't want that. So we want to be able to use containers to help them be able to regulate between sessions, for sure. If you have a DID client, I kind of said that you kind of tuck them away. So this idea of tucking is if they have a part that's processing and it's normally not out, it's hidden. Obviously these parts are usually hidden from each other, or definitely from the outside world. And you bring a part out to process and you do some processing, that part's still out. You have to tuck them back in. And so if you don't, they're going to be intrusive on the person's life. And so, some people's systems work differently. Again, dissociation is the weirdest thing ever and multivariate. But in many cases, you want to bring that part out just for a while and then tuck it back in. And you use imagery to be able to do that. Some people use hypnosis to do it. Has anybody been trained in hypnosis at all? Yeah, so hypnosis can be a really effective tool when you're working with parts to be able to do this tucking, to be using containers, to bring parts out to do the work. Lots of different ways that hypnosis can be very helpful to do that. So you can tuck them in, you can send them on their way. What we want to do in the beginning of the session generally is to tuck the ANP, the apparently normal personality, because that part a lot of times doesn't know about the traumas. And so we don't want to interrupt their lack of knowledge and have them be affected by that, because then they can't be as effective. So sometimes we tuck that part out and then we bring it back at the end of the session. So I know it's probably kind of new information a little bit for some people, and I'm not saying try this right now. I'm saying get training in it and see if you can integrate it if you want to.
I would just point out that the tuck away almost has kind of like a gentleness to it versus we got to get rid of that.
Yeah.
For now, because that would not be received well by that part.
Yeah,
and then we're in trouble. So
Tucking away is gentle, as Lynn was saying. It's not like get out of here. It's hey, this part probably isn't going to like what it's about to see. Is that part willing to kind of go to sleep right now? And so that's why we use hypnosis sometimes. That part can just kind of sleep, or it can go like it's on the screen there in a boat to kind of go down the river and not look back and what it's about to happen, and then we can call that part back and it'll be fine. Yeah, so tucking is a gentle process. Definitely. Great time. Okay, that's a great place to start.
All right, so we got about 15 minutes. Help yourself to water and whatever else is out there. There's also a student lounge. If you go into the glass doors, there's an area there where there's additional coffee or tea, those kinds of things for purchase. I'm just going to check in with these guys here.
Hello, we're here.
All right. I'm going to turn down the microphone just a little bit because you're really loud. So good. How are we doing with sound with you guys?
Not well.
Not very good.
Can't understand anything.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to invite, Pat had sent me a bunch of your email addresses. So I'm going to invite all of you. So then you can download it on your phone and listen by calling in. The issue becomes, though, you might have a lot of background noise because you're all in the same room together. So you might need to mute it, but you might be able to hear it on your phone while you're also seeing it through Gail's laptop. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, that might help you guys. So I'll invite you guys through your email here.
Sorry, I was trying to project, but I don't know what you guys can hear, what you can't.
Yeah.
So I'll try to talk a little bit louder, maybe stand a little bit closer to show you there.
All right.
Like if you're at a workshop and people have
Little pain in my stomach. At the same time, I'm like, this is going on the evaluation.
What is the worst thing?
And I don't know if I can pause the recording or not.
It's not very much, they sent me a
Okay, so
letter.
if they have a mic, pass it.
There we go.
Give me, if I can't see myself, is that okay? It is recording? We can just see them, that's fine. I don't need to see myself, I'm just
No, but
saying.
we want to make sure that you are, yeah, because if we do gallery view, then you can
Okay.
see that way you know what they, and then when we go back to that way, then it's,
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So we're back. I'm standing over here because there's a microphone over here somewhere that I'm trying to get to the Minnesota people and have the recording actually work. So hopefully you guys can hear me better when I'm standing over here. So the next thing we're going to talk about, we're still talking about ego state therapy. Let me click on that. And so just different techniques that we can use. When we're going to be talking to those parts that are inside, those EPs that are inside, we don't want to blurt out, hey, let me talk to this part, let me talk to this part. We want to kind of ask permission. We want to make sure that it's okay that we enter that system. Both asking okay from the ANP, but also from those EPs, and make sure that it's okay if we're accessing the system so we can do some work. So just kind of ask permission to talk through the ANP. I do that with my clients. I just did it last night actually with my client who was working with a protector part, and asked if it was okay if I just kind of asked a couple questions, and then I would do that, and then the part would respond to her, and she would kind of tell me what was going on internally. So it's just a kind of polite thing to do, courtesy for ego state therapy. So using imagery, therapists can guide the nurturing parts sometimes to come in and help a part out that is struggling. So if you know the system and you know there's a nurturing part that might help a part to be able to process something, you can actually call that part in and see if they'd be willing to work with the part in the conference room to do that work, to do some nurturing and kind of create some attachment possibilities between the parts. And some of these clients have disorganized attachment. They've never been able to attach to anything, but we can actually create attachment to self and have a more integrated self that way. So that's helpful as well. Keep in mind that the emotionally upset parts are just child parts, and they can present in lots of different ways. Sometimes the child parts are little cuddly, scared, children, but sometimes they're monsters. But the point about it is there's still a child part that's still really cuddly on the inside and needs all of that nurturance and care and acceptance, even if they look like Frankenstein, even if they're a scary monster, they still need that attunement. And so that's one great thing that we use with brain spotting is the attunement model. But just you as a therapist, having a relational orientation towards that part as a struggling, really scared, younger part, and having that compassion for that.
Josh, if you could slow your speech just a little bit.
Okay.
It's kind of blending all together.
All right. Hyped up and trying to get through.
I know. I'm
Right.
trying to meet all these needs.
I know. All right. Sounds good. So I said I would talk about introjects a little bit. So this is kind of just a definition term that we have in the dissociation milieu. So introjects are ego states that have kind of internalized a perpetrator. So a lot of times they're parents that they'll be able to hear that parent's voice. They'll be able to see the parent sometimes in a hallucinatory way. Internally, they can see the parent a lot of times if that introject is a parent. But perpetrators, and basically what will happen is they'll start to hear those messages from that introject of shame and blame and all the things that they got from those perpetrators in their life, and those become a part. And they'll kind of download that into a part. And so sometimes when you're working with an introject, it actually helps them to know that they're not actually the parent, that they're not actually the perpetrator. They think that they are. That's what the mind has done, is created this idea that they have actually taken the parent and put them inside, and they're in there and they're the parent. But sometimes if we say, father part of the person, you're not actually the father. And so you're off the hook for those things that the father did. That's not you. That you're actually a part of Jimmy, that just internalized the father. And so that's sometimes hard to understand, but it's actually, when they get it, it's very relieving for them to be able to understand that they're just, you know, a part of the person, not the actual perpetrator. And again, you want to talk to those parts in a specific way. You don't want to say, all right, I want to talk to the father right now, or can I talk to the father? You say the father part of the self. And so that really makes that separate. So in their mind, that is just a part of themselves that's kind of acting like the father, or sounds like the father. So that's the way we kind of refer to those parts. And then what's kind of scary sometimes, but really good to know, is that those internal relationships that the parts have with each other can often mirror those dysfunctional relationships that they had with the perpetrator in their families in general, and with other people that were around. So, you know, those family dynamics, those dysfunctional relational dynamics have to be dealt with in some way. I think my question was, how would you address that? You know, if you were going to work with somebody that had these parts that were kind of acting like their childhood family, what would you do? You know, what would you imagine that you could do? Yeah, Jeff.
Just use the family systems approach. I mean, in terms of alignment, where you're aligning is one of the things that I do. So aligning with the part that's being victimized, right? So kind of to kind of help the system balance out. So using more of a system approach really helps me when I don't know what to do in that, especially when I'm doing parts, is I just kind of step back from the systems approach. So, you know, where do I need to kind of like put some loving, caring attention or some protection or whatever, just to provide that to the system. It's oftentimes what it's.
Yeah, so using a family system approach is perfect. And if you're good at any type of family therapy, family dynamics, just employing those techniques, you already have them. You know how to use them when families are in front of you. Well, those families aren't in front of you. It's inside this one person. And so you can still use those same skills. That was good, Jeff. Okay, so we're almost there. We're almost getting to brain spotting. I know it's like, hey, I thought this was about brain spotting and dissociation. I promise we're almost there. But there really is a lot of prep work to do in some cases before we're going to be doing brain spotting with parts, at least. We can do it in other contexts, and they're doing gaze spotting, things like that, and you're doing that work. But when we're working with parts, there's a lot of kind of upfront things that we need to do. So some of the red flags, things that you should kind of be cautious about before you start using brain spotting or doing some trauma processing with dissociative people would be low affect tolerance. So you want to make sure that they know how to use tools to be able to regulate affect, or you can have a part come in to be an affect regulator for that part. You know, if that particular part doesn't have any of those skills. And so low affect tolerance, inability to use resourcing tools. So if they have demonstrated basically that that they haven't been using those resource tools between sessions, it's going to be, you know, difficult for them to use them in session, even if you're kind of there working with them. So make sure that they have that foundation. Suicidality, again, this is an extreme behavior that's coming from a dissociative place. And so if that part is activated and they're being suicidal or thinking suicidally, that's something that we should probably figure out in the moment, either working with that suicidality feeling or trying to help compartmentalize that part to be, and get them calmed down before we start doing any type of processing. So again, these are just kind of extreme situations that are coming up that we want to make sure are managed before we go in and try to do, you know, structured type of processing with any of these internal parts. Self-harm, again, another behavior that could be disrupting. An active eating disorder might be a dissociative parts that's acting out in that particular situation, so it needs to be dealt with. So we're talking to that part of the self that feels like it needs to do the eating disorder behavior. Is that going to block the processing? Can that part be tucked for a while we do this other processing? Kind of working in that way. Any recent hospitalization, again, that means that their system is disorganized in that moment. If you have a disorganized system, they're kind of all over the place. Are they going to be really able to focus and do good processing? It might make it more difficult. So it's not impossible, but it makes things more difficult when these things are happening. And then low rapport with a therapist. So, you know, obviously these different parts have to have pretty good rapport to be able to process in many ways. Trust needs to be built for some of the parts or most of the parts, most likely, before you can do any processing. And then lack of truthfulness, and this is mostly just due to if somebody's lying to you, that's probably a part that's lying to you, and that part is activated. That might not be the part that you need to be working with, and so you might need to tuck that part or do some work with that particular part before it interrupts the process of doing brain spotting in session. So front loading with stabilization work is really important, and doing some cognitive restructuring so that we have these belief systems when we're traumatized, and if we're able to do that cognitive restructuring and get down to kind of a solid base and have those beliefs not get in the way of the processing, that will help as well. So if you can do some belief reconstruction, that would be very helpful. I have one client that was been traumatized in her own awareness since she was 3, probably before that, every day basically of her life up to 19. And, we kind of look at that and say, what does she have to go back to? After she's done with the brain spotting session, where does she land? Does she have much of anything that's constructive that will actually help her out? And so we try to get to all those beliefs and try to work with her to kind of create a part that is helpful and strong. Creating an internal support team will help as well. Again, we're pulling parts in to be able to help with the processing using brain spotting. So just different techniques, different things to look for. At the end of this printout, if you got the email, there's an extra slide that asks questions that you should ask yourself before you start brain spotting. And we can go through those at the end if you like. So right before we start with brain spotting, there's another idea that kind of comes in from kind of the dissociative world in the literature, and that's the idea of fractionated abreaction. So that comes from Cluft and Fine. They have a book that they edited together, and there's a lot of information about that. Cluft has his own book called Shelter from the Storm that talks about fractionated abreaction. And basically what that is, brain spotting EMDR kind of co-opted it to do small chunks of processing, just like 10-minute segments or interrupting the processing and then going back in. And so what it is basically is you're just trying to get the smallest piece of whatever it is that they're processing and just process that much. And usually it decreases the amount of time that you're in session actually doing processing. And it's not necessary, but for some people it's more tolerable. And so if we say, okay, we're going to do processing for 10 minutes today, and we're just going to do this piece, so we're just going to do the pain piece today, it's much more tolerable for them to be able to do that. So it's a technique you can use. You don't have to. You can use regular brain spotting and just have the setups however you want them, but sometimes it's helpful to just break those up into little parts. So then you would isolate that particular part that's holding on to something, and then you would just do brain spotting with that part on that particular issue. Let's see. Okay, and then they can have those helpers along as well as you're doing the brain spotting just with that part. So it sets the frame for the brain spotting session within the window of tolerance, and that's the most important thing, that they can tolerate that particular session. And these are the team here. These are all the parts, and they all have that piece of the puzzle, and you can just process one piece of that puzzle at a time. Okay, now we're brain spotting. This would be the session format for, it doesn't have to follow this exactly. Of course, when you're doing brain spotting, you're tailored to comet, you're kind of working with whatever you got. But this can be, if you're working with a DID client, again, we talked about tucking that apparently normal personality. We want to do that a lot of times if that part does not know about some of these things that you're going to be processing. So if that's the case, you want to tuck that part using hypnosis or imagery. Again, hypnosis is a really good tool just to understand what's going on, because they're in that trance state anyway, and so you're actually working with them hypnotically anyway, even if you're not trained in it and you don't really know much about it. And so it would be pretty helpful if you just understood the mechanics of that hypnosis and how that was working. And so tucking the parts, and then you're going to use the conference room or their workspace to engage that part and to tuck away the parts that also need to be tucked as well. Some parts might not understand SUDS and the other brain spotting setup information, and so you might want to re-explain it to them, tell them what's about to happen, put it in their own language. All of those things are important before you start processing. And then you want to, since they're in the conference room, they're their workspace often, You want to remind them of all the tools that they have at their disposal, whether it's the video screen or the rheostat, where they can put up and down the suds if they need to, and kind of remind them of all those tools that they have at their disposal to be able to have some semblance of control in that situation. And then finally, when you're ready to process, you have that part, whatever part is in that workspace, look through the eyes, and you're going to find a brain spot, just like you would with any other setup. Using brain spotting, you use their preferred setup, or you choose one for them, however it works best for you, and just have them look through the eyes as you're finding the spot, and then you go. Focus mindfulness. You're on your way. You find the brain spot. All right. So any questions about any of that, like how to do a session, what's involved without doing an actual session? It just proceeds as normal, whatever is happening, tail of the comet, curiousness, all the things that we learned in our trainings. Yeah.
Have you ever had where you have like an adult part, like holding a child part on your lap, or any of that kind of stuff while you're doing some of this?
So that's what we call blending. And blending is a technique. Again, all these are kind of higher level techniques that we might have learned it kind of haphazardly and just tried it. But it's really important to understand what's happening when you do the blending, because sometimes it's hard to pull that apart, or to have the system organized in a way that will be not too disruptive to them. We really need to know what's actually going on with those parts when they're blended, have a time frame for them, have something set up where they're going to go back to where they need to be at the end, tuck them if you need to. So it can be a little bit complicated, but yes, you definitely, if they have a part that can hold them and help them through that, we definitely will use that as a tool. Yeah, very good. All right.
I had one other question too. So, I mean, I've done it both through the eyes of, the current setting in front of the eyes.
Yeah.
But I've also done it from the eyes from within that perspective, or from that body part, or from that, and it seems to work fine. I mean, there are some challenges to that, but it definitely seems to work too. I mean, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, so I had a client that would sometimes look through the eyes, but sometimes they were just in the conference room, and then I would have them look in the conference room, the apparently normal part and then the dissociative part, and find their spot. With this particular client, it was always the same spot, it was always the same part of the body, and it was always the same suds. So I didn't find a difference, but I wanted to check in with that. And so check in with it and see if that's the thing, if there's different spots or whatever it is. But absolutely. So the question was, what if they might have a different, the part might have a different spot. Do you check in with that? And you should absolutely do that. So instead of looking just through the eyes of the person, they can internally look and find their spot for that. So the idea of quadruple attunement really is just the play on the words for dual attunement. So the dual attunement is being aware of the client's neurobiology and being aware that the system, the neurobiology of the system of the therapist and the client, and how that's all working. And so, but if you're working with two different parts, or more, you might be working with more, then you have to actually be more attuned. You have to be quadruple attuned. So you have to be attuned to this part and the relationship there, and the physiology there, and then also this part and the physiology there and the relationship there. And they might be switching affects and things. You're just attuning to that. It's going to feel more normal and natural as you're doing it. It's going to be just like a regular brain spotting session, except for different parts that might come in at different times, just to kind of give more of what they're processing, or be able to kind of step forward and kind of do their part of the processing. So quadruple attunement isn't, it's really dual attunement, but there's just know that there might be multiple parts that you're dealing with doing that dual attunement. So I'm watching you. Keep your eyes on them, each of those parts, and make sure that they're being attuned to. Again, it's most important that that part knows that you're attuning to them and that you can see what those differences are. You might acknowledge that through a head nod or whatever it is, just so that they know that you get that you're attuning to them. If there's ego state disruption during processing, so you might have to deal with that ego state when it comes out. So you might be processing and everything's going fine, and all of a sudden there's some kind of weird disruption. They're like stopping processing, it's not going down, something's happening and it's interrupting the process. And what that generally means is there's probably another part that's interrupting that. So there's another ego state that's like, no, they're not ready for that, or I didn't know this was happening, and they're dysregulated, they're disrupted. And so what you'll have to do is work with that part either in the moment and say, okay, I noticed that there's something's going on here. Is there a part, look back in your mind's eye, is there a part that's coming out now that we weren't originally dealing with, that we didn't tuck or didn't know was there? Sometimes parts will come out as you're doing brain spotting, a new part that you never even knew was there. That's definitely a possibility. And so you want to be able to attune to that. That's the quadruple, in this case, sextuple attunement, right? And attune to that and then deal with it in the moment, or say, okay, I noticed that there's disruption. This part isn't really wanting to do anything right now. So let's take a break from that, tuck everything, put everything back together, and then come back in the next session or later that session and address that part and say, hey, can we do some work with this part and figure out what it needs to be able to allow the processing to continue. So I love the phrase from the Ghostbusters, okay, who brought the dog, right? It's this monster that comes in out of nowhere. They have no idea what's going on, and that definitely can happen when you're processing. And then you can use brain spotting to strengthen the connection between internal parts. So I had this one client who had this younger part, and the younger part was stuck in the house where she was sexually assaulted, and she wanted to get out. And so I had the ANP go in, the adult part go in, and climb up this ladder and go in and guide this younger part down. And then she spontaneously took her to this hill that that the ANP actually went to during Sundance, during the Native American Festival, and just had this great spiritual calming experience there. And she just took her to that hill. And then I said, okay, just notice that connection that you have as you're sitting on the hill and you're feeling compassion for this younger part. Let's find a spot for that. And then you can actually strengthen that spot, or that connection between the two by focusing on that connection. So that's a really important way to do integration, but also for attachment stuff. It's really transformative as far as the integrative process. All right, so any questions about any of that stuff? Clipping along well, okay. So ending a session, at the end of the session, what we want to do is we want to gather up any pieces that may be laying around, right? So just ask if there's any of the suds left, if there's any of the memory left, whatever it is, and use those containers that we already in practice using, right? They already know how to use containers. We'll put those into containers, and then we'll deal with those the next time and have them do that however they do that internally, putting those away. So using the vault or the filing cabinet, and then we're tucking away those parts that need to be tucked. We're bringing back those parts, that part that needs to be on the outside if we've already tucked that part, and then we're ready to go. And then, once you've done all of this work and you've worked with this person however long it needs to be worked with, so these parts are feeling integrated and they're feeling more like a whole person, and they're not, popping out into these different personalities or just different ego states, that's basically what you're looking at is kind of a neural network that's functioning together. And that's kind of where we get that internal family systems idea, is that these parts, we all have these parts and they all can work together to help each other. And we don't need to be so fractionated and dissociated from each other. All right. What else we got here? Okay, so now I have 3 different clients that I'm going to talk about, just to give you actual examples of things that I really did using brain spotting and working with dissociation in real life. And so I had this client, Jay. I just discharged him a couple months ago. Jay I discharged about maybe 8 months ago, actually. But just saw him at a festival that I went to. He was working, he was doing his job, looked very happy, and kind of was just doing his thing, and had this job for a couple of years, which was pretty awesome. Definitely was not ready for it when we first started working together. So he presented with dissociated ego states, so they weren't alters. He didn't lose any time when these different kind of parts showed up and kind of acted these certain ways with his parents or in school and things like that. And so when he did his mind's eye and went to the conference room, he saw anything from like this dark smoke ego state. That's actually a thing. I've had several clients actually have this dark smoke be in their conference room, and it's a part that they're working with. It's very interesting. And one of his one of his parts was this assassin character from a comic book, and so he was really into comic books, and that's the way a couple of his parts had come out. He was adopted from a different country. He had reactive attachment disorder when we first started working together. That's why they put me on the case originally. We worked through a lot of that stuff between his parents, and he actually did very good work there. But then he had all this other stuff kind of coming out later on. He had a broken leg when he showed up at the orphanage in this other country when he was 3 years old, and they had no idea. He had no idea, and they had no idea how his leg got broken when he showed up into the foster system. So obviously some bad stuff was happening, and he had no recollection. He couldn't speak any of the language when he came here. He couldn't speak any of the language. He just lost all of that. He was amnesic for that entire portion of his life when he was there. So what we did was we used the conference room, and we ID'd these different internal states. And then when we were doing processing, I would have him bring up the memory or whatever it was on the screen in the conference room. And then I would have him and the part do a SUDS, so do a body scan and then do a SUDS to find that part of the body. And then I would have the part look through the eyes, and sometimes it was internal. I would have the parts kind of look in front of them and try to find a spot. But again, for this client, it was always the same spot, always the same sensation, always the same SUDS. So that was nice. It probably because there wasn't a huge amount of dissociation. It wasn't an alter. It was just kind of like a part that had kind of split off a little bit. So, and then we would usually do shades down processing, which means eyes closed. And after we found the spot on the outside, we would usually do shades down, sometimes shades up. And it would just proceed like normal. And then at the end, I would have him ask the part, are you at, what SUDS are you at? And then we would do squeeze limit 0 for both him and the part. But it was always, again, with this guy, the same SUDS every time. We also, other processing with brain spotting with him is he had boundary rupture. Boundary rupture is when, we have some people who, if you come up from behind them, they freak out. And they have different, if you come from this side of this particular angle, they have these sensations that come up. And so those are what we call boundary ruptures. And so I can't remember the guy who was at that presentation up in Appleton who taught us about how to process boundary ruptures.
Starts with M. Marcus.
Marcus, okay.
Marcus.
Yeah.
He worked with Robert Scare.
Yeah, he worked with Bob Scare, and so he taught us that, and so I actually have used it ever since then. And so we did 360 degree. I stood in front of him, and he said if he had any SUDS going on, I did a body scan. I'd stand a little bit like this and a little bit around. And as I went around, if he had some activation, I would say, now you go internal into your conference room and notice if that's a part or if that's just your normal reaction to what's going on. And then we would do brain spotting for that particular activation for that particular spot. And he had maybe 3 or 4 spots that were around him. And then his mom could hug him after that. He would always be phobic of her hugs. She obviously was devastated by that. But after that, he had no problem with her hugging and coming up from behind and touching him on the shoulders. That was really helpful for him. All right. So B is a client that I've been working with for about 3 years now, I believe, approximately 2 to 3 years. Extensive early sexual, physical, mental abuse from just family members, uncles, brothers-in-law, just lots of different people in their environment that abused her. And her father was alcoholic, and she found him dead when she was 12. So that was obviously a trauma. And her mother and her father were both avoidantly attached, and so that obviously creates some dissociation there as well. So her brain was really good at dissociation. I mean, she has one of the best brains for dissociation I've ever seen. It does such a fabulous job in lots of different ways. So she had some numbing going on when she would talk about certain topics. She said like this numbing sensation would come from her back over to the top of her head. She would topic switch all the time. She would come in and start talking about this and then flip to that and flip to that. And all these different parts we realized later were trying to get out their piece. And so that was happening a lot. She had spontaneous affect shifts. She had vocalization. So she would start to talk like a 5-year-old and be unaware of doing that. And lots of intrusive thoughts. She'd just be talking, and then she became very comfortable later on telling me, oh, I just had this thought, this like sexual thought. and I wasn't trying to have it, just kind of popped in there. And so she was really good about telling me when things were going on like that. So initially, she just wanted to try to do some brain spotting on some of the traumas. So I said, okay, let's do it. You know, tail of the comet, trying to follow it where she's going. And so we tried brain spotting, but she wasn't. She had a really difficult time with the number for SUDS, but she could tell me kind of intensity or whatever. And so it seemed like she would do really good processing, but get down to like a SUDS of 2 to 5. Like it wasn't. She said it's still there. I could still feel it, but you know, and she just had a hard time getting to 0, and it almost never went like that. So that's an indicator. Probably there's a part that might be involved, holding on to some of that somatic information, and so we might need to work with that part to let go of some of that stuff. And so slowly over time, after she had kind of been talking like a 5-year-old a few times and having these different symptoms, I kind of broached the topic of dissociation, of different possible, you know, parts of what she thought about that. And she said, well, I've always kind of had this feeling, this number in my head of 5. And then she kind of internally imagined that there was these 5 different parts of her. And what ended up happening was she, in her sessions, she would come in and say, today's an under the table day. And she would literally sit underneath my table. I have a table in my office that it's like a kitchen table kind of, but it's like pushed against the wall and against the couch. And so underneath there, it's very cozy. And so she'll say it's an under the table day. And that's like, I believe that's her 5-year-old part that wants to go underneath there. And then each part has a different part of the room. So on the couch, sitting like where clients typically sit is her ANP. And then a little bit over from that is another part of her, actually all the way away from me, but on the couch is another part. Back in the corner, farthest away from me, of course, is the teenage part. And then behind the couch, actually moved the couch out. She needs to be behind there. It's a 3-year-old part. And then there's like a maybe, I think it's like a 6 or 7-year-old part or something that always wants to color. It's on the floor. And then recently we started working with a protective part that sits right next to the door, but in the corner. And so wherever she comes in, she'll say, I need to be over here today. She'll go there, and then we'll do the parts work with that particular part. So it's very interesting how her system is kind of set up in that way. They're all younger parts, she feels like, of her. And again, she's done some internal work where she can see those parts and their different ages and things. And so she does a lot of gaze spotting underneath the table for sure. I can't really see where she's looking, but I'll say, you know, I'll notice affect coming up and say, just notice that. She'll have headphones on a lot of times. And I'll say, just kind of notice where you're looking, notice that affect that's going with that. And there's a lot of like aloneness and different things that'll come up that she'll process through very well. And then she's the one that kind of came up with this metaphor of being this wrestling ring and doing the tag teams, which was great. So her workspace is either the closet. She had this closet that she grew up in, this house where they had a closet that had a stained glass window from the outside. It probably wasn't originally a closet, they made it one. And so she would sit in there and be the safest part of the house. Not there was one, but that was the safest part. So she would do some work in there. She also did some work in the living room. And so she would gather her parts in the living room, do some work. We used Brainspotting to create those connections. She was the one that took the younger part of her up on the hill. So we did that Brainspotting and connections, the gaze spotting. And then sometimes if I wanted to know more information than she was kind of having access to, I would talk through her, ask permission to talk through her to get to the protective part or one of the younger parts, just to get those questions asked and answered, and that would progress the therapy as well. I learned tucking from her, actually. So what happened was, she was behind the couch, which is a 3-year-old, and she came out from behind the couch after doing some processing and did some, you know, like regular talking, you know, what are we going to do for the weekend, and try to just get her grounded again. And then I noticed that she seemed a little off. You know, I said, how are you doing? You know, are you okay? And she's like, yeah, I'm okay. I'm fine to leave. So she leaves, and then she tells me the next week that she got into her car, and all of a sudden she hears this voice in her head that says, I can't drive. I'm 3. So after that, we started doing some tucking. And so now when we work at the part, we say, okay, wherever that part needs to go, and then we send them back to wherever they need to go. And our parts are pretty easy that way. We don't have to use structured hypnosis or anything like that. They're pretty easy that way. So tucking. All right, so my last guy that I wanted to talk about today is Skylar. So Skylar's a very complicated case because he not only had DID, but he also had FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And that complicates everything. Just working with FASD is difficult, and working with somebody with FASD and DID is very complicated. And so his father, his adoptive father, actually sexually abused him from ages 5 and mentally and physically. From ages 5 until 11. 11 is when his mom found out about it, and then she immediately went to the police and they had court and everything. And so after that, she knew he was traumatized. She looked into it, and so she got him some help. And so I came in and started doing EMDR. It was really before I knew that much about working with dissociation. I knew about dissociation. I knew what to look for, kind of, but I wasn't really skilled in it. And so I was just like, oh, this kid's traumatized. Let's create a list of traumas that he went through. And he created a list of 30 things that his father had done, more than 30 things. And so we just clicked off. Each session I would show up, and if he was willing to process, we'd use an EMDR, and we'd process before I knew brain spotting. And so we went through the entire list. He had originally had this fireball that was inside him that he couldn't feel anymore. He wasn't acting out in school. He was behaving very well at home. He was an apparently normal person, which is exactly what he ended up being. A couple months later, when he was at school, some incident happened, and a cop had grabbed his arm in the principal's office and yanked on him, and all of a sudden the gladiator came out and destroyed the principal's office. And so he didn't know it was a gladiator. He didn't know what happened. He just knew he had blacked out, and he destroyed the principal's office. And so they brought me back in because he had had this incident and said, you know, something's going on with him. You know, maybe we didn't get to all the traumas. I was like, you know, let's see what's up. So he told me he blacked out. Number 1 red flag, blacked out. You're probably dissociating to some degree, definitely. When you don't remember stuff is happening, you're amnesic. So then he started to have these little weird behaviors that he wasn't remembering doing. Like one of them was, the reason I have a picture of the truck is he stole the truck that his mom was borrowing. It was his grandfather's truck, and he stole that. It was on surveillance camera. She showed me on her phone, like, their surveillance video. It was the weirdest thing. It was just this kid who looked like he was completely checked out, and just like, he's a tiny kid, and he's like pushing this huge truck back a little bit and then getting in, and he had his dog in the truck, and he was like turning the wheel, and then he pushed it a little bit more. He was trying to leave without, you know, making noise or whatever, without turning on the truck. And so he did this thing, and it took him about 25, 30 minutes, I don't know how long, forever to do this thing, to get it down the hill, and then you just see this truck speeding off in the background. And so what ended up happening was he came to the next morning. This was at night. The next morning, he was shirtless, shoeless. He had his dog with him and no truck. And he was like 10 miles away from his house. So I was like, big ding, ding, ding. This dude definitely has some stuff going on. And so we started to explore what that could be. We created a conference room, and this gladiator part came out. And then it was a protected part. It was holding on to all this rage. And then over time, I used parts work to be able to help. And that's when I just really started studying everything and started doing as much as I could, and started drawing that rage out and having him titrate that and be able to process that using that fractionated abreaction, little chunks at a time, processing with brain spotting. Eventually, I learned brain spotting in that little intro, and thank goodness, and we were able to brain spot that. So let's see what else we got here. So he eventually had 35 ultras that came out consecutively. None of them came out at the same time that we were aware of, at least, which was nice, because then we could just deal with one thing at a time. All of them, it was so amazing, because you get 35, like, you must have doubled up on something. Like, two of them must be holding on to pain or whatever. It was really interesting is that each one of them, it was like another little piece of his puzzle that had happened to him that was like, oh, of course you need to process that part. You know, stuff happened to his dog. All the memories of the dog are in this part, right? So it was, each one had their very specific thing, and that probably comes from, spitting here. That probably comes from his, the way that his brain works with the FASD. It just compartmentalized like that. The autistic people that I work with that are dissociative often have this very structured way that their parts work as well, and they're just one thing. It's just very structured. So when you're hitting one thing, you kind of can go all the way through it, which was nice with him.
He learned self-spotting. He did a lot of self-spotting, a lot of his processing on his own because he would run away. His parts would run away from the house. And then he would do some self-spotting when he was out. When he would come to, he would ask if he could do some processing on whatever it was because he was very good. He was very in tune with his parts. He realized that that was what was going on and he wanted to get help for it. He did more work between sessions than we did in sessions, which was really, really nice. And I checked in with him each time to make sure that he was actually doing processing. I asked him what the suds were when he started, what it was when he was done, what the feeling states were they different at all, and what it's like now. And I really checked in with him, and it seemed like he really did all of that work. And eventually, he's integrated. I discharged him 2 months ago, and he's doing great. Got a job, and he's functioning very well. So let's see, what else do we do? Oh. During that 2-year period of time, though, year and a half, 2 years that I was working with those 35 parts, 2 extra parts were created. And I didn't know this could happen until I was doing all this research and these extra parts were coming out. So what happened was when he was like 14 or 15, when the first part came out, or the first alter came out, and then during that time he turned 16 and he's 17 now. And so that's a very tumultuous time. It's a time of progression, so we're getting jobs, we're thinking about the future, and so he created 2 parts, not knowingly, they just kind of came out. One of them was a female, we called her Cinderella, and she was meant to help him get through that developmental stage of what am I going to do in the future, because he had lost all of those things that he wanted to do before after doing all this processing, and so he was struggling with that, and a new part was created. So watch for that as well, that just because nothing's happening to them now, they can still create these new parts to help them deal with those new challenges that are coming up for them developmentally. Yeah. So that's it for those 3 people. It's the end of the presentation. This is my list of resources. I read all of these books and gleaned all the information from this. I did consultation with Rick Hoffler, and then consulted the online organization for International Society of Dissociation and Trauma. And you can go to Midwest Brainspotting Institute.org, brainspotting.pro. And if you want to get training in hypnosis, ASCH.net is a website you can go to. They do great trainings in hypnosis if you're interested in doing that. It really is helpful, at least to just learn the mechanics of what's going on there with hypnosis. And all of those other books, if you have questions about a particular book, I'll definitely let you know, but they were all very instrumental in helping me understand all these processes. And the last bit of information before we go to questions is we have a fundraiser with David Grand. It's on September 15th, a Friday. He's going to be in Green Bay. It's from 7 to 10. It's a fundraiser. We're going to have baskets that you can do a silent auction on. We're going to have raffles, lots of fun stuff. So definitely check that out and make sure that you come on up and meet David Grand and listen to him talk and all of that fun stuff. We're going to have a photo booth. My friend said he's definitely going to do a photo booth for that. So that'll be fun as well. Yeah. So this is question time. Yeah, so we'll get you guys online. If you guys have questions, definitely let us know. Okay?
Let's get them involved and see.
All right, guys, so Minnesota group, if you want to take your mute off so we can hear your voice and hear some of your questions.
Here we are.
Sorry.
Since you guys haven't gotten to ask any questions yet, you guys get to go first. Do you have any questions?
I have a quick question about using the conference room, that technique. As far as when you bring all those parts into the conference room, then are you taking each part and brain spotting just that part and then moving on to the next part? Is that kind of how I'm hearing that?
Yeah. It really depends on what is needed. So there might be a few different parts that are associated with a particular memory. They have a particular aspect of it that they all feel like, yeah, we can all process this at the same time and allow all that stuff. Just like if a person does not have this type of dissociation and you're just doing regular brain spotting, they have physical sensations, they have thoughts that are going on, your brain goes through the whole dissociation capsule. And so each of them is kind of holding onto a different part of that possibly. And
right.
Get them together at the same time to kind of release those as a regular brain spotting process. So that's a possibility. You can also just have one of them be kind of like I said, a caretaker of a different part that's actually doing the processing. So there's different ways to use that conference room with the different parts.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Anything else before we turn to the rest of the audience?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear? Okay. So, first of all, I don't work with DID.
Okay.
I do work with traumatized people.
All right.
What I'm hearing you talk about here, the way to do brain spotting, is very different from, I would say, what we've been instructed in terms of how to do brain spotting.
Okay. In what way does it sound?
Well, let me put it this way. Of course, David Grand's the initiator of brain, or the creator of brain spotting.
Yeah.
Do you think that when he works as a brain spotter, he's incorporating all these different parts that you're talking about?
I have a hand in the audience who knows, so I'm going to turn you over to Jeff. So I don't know if you can hear him. If you can't hear him, let me know. Maybe you can come up and help us out.
So David has always said that he sees brain spotting as parts work. So he sees it as an integrated approach. And so I think that that's really helpful. And Josh has made it much more distinct in terms of making it an express parts work. But essentially, brain spotting is a parts work. It's another way to think about brain spotting as
Jeff, I understand that. Jeff, before you go, this is, hi. Can you see me?
No.
Okay. Hi.
It's dark in there. We can't really see much, just shadow.
Because this has come up. I know the brain spotting is parts work. And I work with parts too, conceptually. But it's still quite different because at least what I'm hearing Josh talk about today, I think is quite different. When we were trained in brain spotting, let's say back to level 1, basically we were encouraged, first of all, to move into processing, to not be afraid to process, to be somewhat wary of over-resourcing, right? And to just move right into processing, the assumption being that the brain, that client's brain is sort of taking care of a lot and that it's safe to do that. Well, that's pretty different from what I'm hearing Josh describing today.
Okay, so that's a really great point. So when I'm talking, it kind of goes back to B. When I was working with B initially, we just went into brain spotting, and she did some processing. But again, she only got down to that suds of like 2 to 5, and so that's when we have to start doing the parts work. Is when, or that's when I feel like it might be helpful to use the parts work. Is that when we're doing brain spotting normally, and it's not going to completion. It's not getting to a suds of 0. There might be a part of her that's holding on to it that is so dissociated that network isn't able to get into that part and what the part's holding on to. And so when that's happening, then we can go and work with that possible part to see if it will allow those sensations, thoughts, feelings, memories, whatever, to be processed along with it. So I start out with brain spotting sometimes, but sometimes it gets interrupted and I can't do any more until I do the parts work.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say, and I did get that, if you're getting a suds that's not getting down to 0, or not getting down really low, but you're getting sort of stuck at 2 to 5, then bring in parts work. And that does make sense to me, but I'm still going to say that the notion that the cautionary notes that you put out about stabilizing before brain spotting, that I heard you saying that, is very different from what we were taught in terms of how to use brain spotting.
Sorry, so I missed your whole premise of your question. So that's only after you've figured out that there are actual parts that are disrupting it. Then you use that stabilization with the parts that you know are there and are also disrupting it. That's when you use that stuff.
Yes, I do get that. But if you were simply brain spotting with someone, you aren't going to be. You see what I'm saying here? There's a contradiction here to me in terms of the way what you're talking about. What I hear you saying is very traditional. I'm going to call it traditional trauma therapy, which I'm not arguing with it. I'm just saying it is fundamentally in some way very different from what we've been taught about brain spotting.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's got something for you.
I want to just add, when you take phase 1 training, in there on the very third day, we talk about folks that are at the other end of the continuum where they're more into ego states, DDNOS, folks that primarily dissociate often. And in that third day on phase 1 training, we talk about that brain spotting itself is not going to tell you how to work with dissociation, but to get the additional training, internal family systems, or developmental needs meeting strategy, or some of these resources that that Josh has indicated here, okay? These are guidelines on how to work with those on the other end of the spectrum. Who you're talking about are individuals that you're working with, from what I'm understanding, and if I'm assuming something, please tell me, they're in the window of tolerance. So what Josh is talking about are individuals that are outside of the window of tolerance, that it needs to be adapted. We need some additional resources because what we're doing with brain spotting doesn't keep them in the window of tolerance anymore. So I hope that clarifies things a little bit better.
It doesn't. It really doesn't clarify to me, and I'll tell you, I'm still seeing contradictions between the two. First of all, I don't honestly remember from my level 1 training this whole caveat that you're describing. Maybe
okay.
I don't think it was there. Maybe I'm just not remembering it, but I don't think
it was there.
It was there?
Yeah, it was there.
Then I didn't take that in then.
Yeah.
If you look in your book, it's like the last couple of pages.
Yeah, it's the very last day of the training, and we talk about all of that in the last day.
That may, just a minute. That may be, but it was very minimized then in terms of what we were based. Now, as I said, I'm not working with extreme DID. So, but I would argue that if someone's been traumatized, there's always going to be dissociation in some form within that person.
Right.
I mean, often people are going in and out of their window of tolerance often. So it isn't just DID people who are outside of their tolerance.
Right.
I'm responding.
This is when it's more pervasive and that they really struggle being inside the window of tolerance.
Okay, so maybe it is that we're just talking about 2 different categories of clients. That could be.
Yes, and that this is how Josh has learned to work with clients that are outside of the window of tolerance. And I would say I have a different style than that, and Jeff has a different style than that. And so these are just educational resources. We're not telling you do this when this happens, but they're educational resources because a lot of our community is still learning about dissociation. And we wanted to meet that need. We're not saying, do this and do that. Fundamentally, brain spotting, you stick with the fundamentals of brain spotting, the guidelines, the setup, and so forth. But this is for folks that are pervasively and consistently outside of the window of tolerance on the other end of the spectrum, where they have ego states and DDNOS and DID. And phase 3, which David is coming and teaching in September, he does parts work, which would be different, give you another avenue of resources about how to use brain spotting, with parts.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah, please feel free to follow up with any additional questions because we really don't want you to be confused by it at all.
Can you turn off? Yeah. So a couple questions from the audience then. What do we have out here?
You weren't going to go?
I want to go now.
It is.
And you did a little bit of parts work in phase 2 when you were there.
Yeah.
That was
in parts.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, in my mind, and if you do go to these people in the International Association, they will differ in their opinion of what is actually happening. And so I just have my own construct of what that is. So my construct that I've gotten from my supervisor in reading and all that stuff is that
those neural networks that get used when they're being traumatized over and over and over again that eventually become dissociated, they get stronger and stronger, and eventually those would turn into ego states. Those ego states, you pop into it, you don't lose any time. You know, I can have a conversation with a 6-year-old ego state now, and that person will still remember the conversation the next time.
Like a kind of inner child.
Exactly, inner child stuff. And that's where, you know, internal family systems, always things can kind of come into play. People have different ways of looking at it. So my way is it's structural, and so that neural network gets a little bit separated, dissociated, and so you're working with that ego state. It's not, there's no amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you go into the DID, to the alter, that there's amnesia between parts, and most often from the ANP, the apparently normal personality. So to me, that's the difference between them. I don't know if other people have different constructs, but that's my difference between ego state and alter.
So are the alters always losing time? They lose time, like if they're, for example, they can remember what they did throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an alter, or is that just dissociate?
So yeah, it's kind of a spectrum, a continuum, and some alters can have knowledge of that stuff, but some alters are amnesic. And some alters know about other alters, but they're amnesic of the other ones. And so it really just depends on who you're talking about internally. But that's the general feature, is there is amnesia with an alter, depending on between parts or between the outside and the inside.
Sure.
Yeah.
On the third day of the brain spotting phase 1, we talk about like every person that has dissociation, you know, heavier duty dissociation is like a Swiss watch. Like their system is organized a certain way, and it's our job to attune and figure out, or help them figure out how their system is constructed or structured. And so sometimes parts will even blend. Like I've had clients where there's a part watching, the parts switch. So there's like a watcher aware of all the switching that goes on, which I think you kind of call the snitch, right?
Snitch, yeah.
That is
manager,
watching everything and
yeah.
sees everything, and then does a report of what's going on. So that part's not amnesic of all the other parts, and it might blend and watch as they're switching.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The way that I conceptualize it really helped me to kind of get my head around this is that this is a fully integrated system, right? There's no kind of dissociative capsules that are kind of like locked away.
Yeah.
And then some systems have these capsules that are permeable, like the information goes in and out of it. And then some systems have locked, you know, like there can be parts of the system that are completely locked up. They're like, and so this is kind of like DID.
Like nothing's going in there.
Nothing's going in, nothing's coming out.
Right.
Then this is kind of more ego state, you know, and then this is a fully integrated system.
Right.
We're all on the continuum somewhere on this, right? And so, and you can have combinations of, like in most systems, you're going to have, like when you get up here, you're going to have like all of these together into a system, right? So some there's information going back and forth. Some there's parts, you know, DID basically have 1 or 2 or 3 of these where there's no information kind of coming out.
Yeah.
So that just helped me when I saw that in the structural dissociation. That's kind of map out using the genogram of basically kind of like having a solid circle, you know, semi-permeable circle. You know, it just helped me to be able to get my head around stuff.
Yeah.
So confusing.
So Jeff was kind of saying when you have an integrated self, you don't really have a lot of barriers between those parts. When you have an ego state, it's kind of semi-permeable. There's access to the different parts, but it's semi-closed off. And then when you have the DID, then it's a closed off part that not much comes in or out, if anything.
All right, so we're just checking in again to see if you guys have additional questions in Minnesota.
No, we don't have any additional questions.
Okay.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. The audio is fantastic. Second half.
See that sometimes when you're doing therapy with people, brain spotting, the alter doesn't come out, or some alters don't come out.
Right.
Continue just with the permeable.
Yeah. Yeah, it really depends on the system.
Yeah, and sometimes brain spotting in itself is diagnostic because it's through the brain spotting that the DID gets revealed. Or parts.
Yeah. Who invited the dog? Who brought the dog?
What else? Yeah. So,
If you can go back a little bit and just explain what you were mentioning, that some of these clients hear their parents or the abuser is the perpetrator, and I'm confused on when you mentioned that they should be referred to as the father of the self.
The father part of the
The
self.
father part of the self.
Yeah.
Because I'm confused because this is a new concept.
Okay. Interjects?
Yes.
Okay.
And I have clients, and we've had a lot of clients who, whenever we do brain spotting, they hear those voices, they hear the perpetrator.
Yeah.
They kind of portray. So I'm confused. I'm just explanation.
So it's just a dissociated part that has basically downloaded the parent and all of their affects, all of the things that, basically the parent had done to them and all their messages, and it just downloaded that. And that part believes it's the parent or the perpetrator, whatever it is. And so that internal voice that they're hearing sounds like the parent because we download voices all the time, right? I can hear Michael Jackson singing in my head when I think of a song, right? So just that same way, that parent part, that introject is I think I forgot to mention this part. So with the interjects, the reason why that happens is because when that parent is the perpetrator, you have to have a way to handle the idea, that loss of relationship with that person, but also maintain some kind of connection. And so when you internalize that helps you to deal with that loss. It dissociates that loss for you because that part is in there. It's in there. But unfortunately, it contains all the messages from that person and all those bad things that were happening. And then, like I said, you want to let them know, hey, you're not actually the dad. You're just this part that is kind of downloaded to the dad, and we can work with those things that you're holding on to.
And if you give me the brain spotting.
Yes, to process whatever it is that they're holding on to. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
I found that was huge, especially the clients that set boundaries with a perpetrator parent. It's almost as though in order to keep the idea of a parent, that loyalty to that parent,
Yes.
they have to keep that part alive.
Yes.
It's a double bind.
Yeah, they have to keep what Terry's saying. They have to keep that introject as a connection to. Oh, they're gone. Oh, to. Bye.
We're still recording for them, but they left.
See you guys. Thank you. So to keep that connection to that parent, and to manage that loss of relationship.
Right. Keep some form of family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It takes a while for that to.
I had one client that was the only person that ever paid attention to her. Was her father, who was sexually abused her every day of her life for 16 years. That she's wearing, probably 19. But yeah, so she had to keep that part internally to manage any kind of connection whatsoever. What else? Got 3 hands up at the same time. Debbie?
This is going out from the tangent, but I'm talking about blacking out as a part of dissociation. I was wondering, like, through college, a lot of people always talk about going out and blacking out while drinking.
Yeah.
How related or unrelated are those?
They actually found that the same mechanism happens in the brain when you, the same thing gets shut off when you black out dissociatively and when you're drunk. That Rick told us that one. Yeah. Yep. So the brain chemicals come up, they shut it off, they help you out, right? Yeah.
I just wondered, what was the term internal support team?
Yeah. So those are those other parts that aren't the part that's processing, but they can be supportive and helpful. They're stronger parts, they're nurturing parts. They might not be holding on to any of the trauma at all, but they just might be there to comfort.
With the DID.
Yeah, with the DID, or there might be dissociated ego state. I guess that feels more cozy with the system.
Yeah, give an example of how you might bring them into this conference room.
Yeah, so you can talk through. You ask permission and talk through, and say, is there a part of you that feels compassion towards yourself, that feels care, love, anything towards yourself that's positive, a strong feeling that you have of feeling confident or strong that you can use while you're processing so that you don't get too dysregulated. Yeah.
I'm going to go back with my initial question. And so, I don't know, maybe if you have, you can help me how to try to differentiate the AD symptoms with maybe going through schizophrenia.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Thank you for perfect. So I actually have gotten a lot of clients, several clients who have come from the mental health complex who have schizoaffective disorder. They don't. They don't have schizophrenia. What they have is voices in their head. And psychiatrists generally, sorry psychiatrists, many of you know what to do with it, but many of them don't know what to do with it because they know if they're hearing voices, they're psychotic, they need a pill for the psychosis, which in many cases that's very appropriate. Sometimes they're just traumatized. Sometimes they're just dissociating and they're hearing those voices, but because they're also depressed, they're thinking, oh, it's probably schizoaffective, we got pills for that. And so that's my kind of opinion on it, but that's what I've seen in clinical practice is a lot of those times they're not actually schizoaffective. But if they are, they're going to also have those other symptoms of schizophrenia. They'll have the delusions, they'll have all those other symptoms, and you can diagnose schizophrenia by itself in that client. Schizoaffective is schizophrenia and major depression. You can define both of them within the client. And so if they don't have those other symptoms, if they're just hearing voices, most likely it's just dissociative.
So you will take delusions like more schizophrenia?
Well, if there's delusions, sometimes it can just be weird beliefs that happen from trauma, so we want to check in on that. But if they're more very delusional, then it's probably more towards the schizophrenic side. Yeah.
I'm dealing with a client. I have a client that has some symptoms that she's hearing voices. It's a male, it's external male voice. She doesn't recognize who is a voice, but the voice tells her to harm the kids,
Okay.
to do what she was done to her, sex abuse.
Yeah.
And so that is the part of it. Okay. The part of what the voice is telling her is the part that,
Yeah, so the other thing, again, this is my understanding of what has happened based on research and things, is that you can't have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder without having trauma or an extended period of high stress, which basically amounts to trauma anyway. And so because that schizophrenia is coming out, if it is schizophrenia, they've had trauma. And so they probably have the dissociation that goes with that. Well, they do for peritraumatic dissociation, but there might be other structural dissociation that goes along with that. That might be what they're hearing. Even if they're schizophrenic, that might also just be a part of them that's dissociated from them, that's saying those things. And they also have the delusions, which is more, and diagnoses are just collections of behaviors, right? And so what is what? But we can actually access, if they're on their medication and stabilized, we can actually access those parts possibly with doing this parts work and then doing some brain spotting or whatever with those parts. That's a possibility. So think of it in terms of yes and maybe.
Yeah, that is what I'm, and I'm trying to figure out. I don't want to label her, and I don't want to refer her to maybe when she gets home medicated and she doesn't get the proper, treatment,
Yeah.
So that's why.
When they come to me, if they're only having the voices, I'm going to try to do some parts work and see what's going on first. And the ones that have come to me that just had that symptom, we just did parts work and those were integrated.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I was just to kind of piggyback off that a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I very well might be, but my understanding was that schizophrenia, usually there's a later, I don't want to say later onset of voices, but that sometimes when you ask somebody like, well, when did you start hearing voices? Sometimes they might be like, well, I've had this forever. I remember being in kindergarten and hearing stuff, and that I would think would be incredibly rare for kids. So,
Yeah, that would definitely indicate probably a dissociated ego state or part, especially if they had those imaginary friends. If you're truly traumatized, imaginary friends turn into ego states, turn into alters eventually later on in a lot of cases. So that's a really good point. If it happens really early, then it might just be dissociation. If it happens later after all this stuff happens, it might be a new part that's created, because that's happened, but it might
She told me that when she was a child, she had voices, but they disappeared, and just until now that both of them came back.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because I think schizophrenia usually is
Okay.
what, later teens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know.
Teens and early
Thank
20s,
you.
yeah.
So as you're talking, I thought of one of my clients who is actively using heroin.
Yeah.
And so doing this work with them and while they're still using,
Mhm.
plus around there.
Yeah, so if they're, so people use heroin and other opioids to start the dissociative process. To it's like cutting. They're using it for that piece. So if they're actively high, it's probably going to be impossible to get to them. But if they're between, using, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't. I mean, they're prime examples of dissociation. I mean, they're trying to get to the dissociated state. So I don't think it would hinder if between sessions, between being high, that you would do this work. Yeah.
Just because
you know more about it
my
than I do.
specialty in terms of, so I would put it on your list of red flags.
Yeah.
So I would add it to that.
Actively using.
Yeah, actively
Sure.
using and also actively withdrawing, right? I mean, in terms of, so it can really disrupt the system where it can't stabilize, right? So it definitely can impair it. But then it also can be, especially with heroin, for example, I mean, you can overdose really easily on it, so it can be this dangerous threat that you need to kind of stabilize. So, I mean, smoking weed would not, because there's not a danger threat level to it. The red flag is not there. So certain drugs, it's just one thought.
Yeah. But you wouldn't never use brain spotting just because or parts work, whatever, just because they were, a heroin user. You would still attempt it, but in a stabilized state, if they're not,
correct. Yeah, so just definitely kind of trying to stabilize their system, enough. I mean, some people can't get clean without dealing with trauma, so you have to kind of dive into that. For others, they can abstain and then do the work.
Yeah.
And so it's just about working on their system and find what works.
Yeah.
Just a couple of comments that I'd like to make is I used to think before I had brain spotting that I was just working with complex PTSD and dissociation.
Yeah.
And so I think, it wasn't until I really started to know what to look for and be more present with the client that, lo and behold, I started to have more DID clients.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I want to just make sure it's on the recording, in case, other people are going to look at this.
So you're saying that you're able to use it diagnostically and notice those parts more that you're using brain spotting because of that attunement.
Yeah, I've been educated now, and I understand red flags, and I get it. Like, why isn't this clearing? And that kind of thing. Yep. And then the second thing that I think is really important. This is what we know right now.
Yeah.
These are some things that we know we can use to get access to this stuff where years ago we weren't able to get access to it.
Yeah.
And that just like brain spotting, this too is going to evolve.
Yeah.
And so it's not written in stone. This is just for education so that our community can start to understand dissociation. So I just want to thank you because it's a very complicated topic for you doing the research and gathering all these resources for us.
Yeah, Jeff and I were saying we can't wait until they've taken all the things that people are thinking and knowing about dissociation, put them all together and figure it really out so that we can do better work and more.
And I can say that High Fry is working on that right now on an advanced resource model for people, so that we actually have a model in brain spotting of how to work with people that are outside of those counters. So it's coming. It's just a matter of this is what we know right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
sorry.
like character disorder?
What's that?
Would that include people with character disorder traits or?
Like personality disorders?
Yeah.
Borderline. Yeah, so borderlines are like attachment kids that never got treatment and grew up, and so attachment related issues usually have dissociative component to it for sure. And then narcissistic, they had to do a lot of dissociating when they had to do a lot. Narcissistic personality, they had to do a lot of dissociating when they were little. That's what created all that narcissistic, tendencies. So yeah, that's what you're looking at with personality disorders, as far as I've seen and thought about them. Yeah.
Okay, so I just started seeing this client who told me that he has had 52 ECTs.
Okay.
What do I need to look for as far as because I want to do some brain spotting.
Yeah.
but I'm not sure. 'cause
Look for a
there's just lot
TBI.
of
Jesus.
in that brain.
It's really hard because it takes a while for them to get back online after that. It takes a long time for their brain to kind of get back online after that. And then, they're, I don't know enough about it to talk too much about it. I know it can complicate things. There can be some damage that's done. And,
You might want to consult with Laura Hillsheim.
Yeah.
Up in Green Bay, because she's worked with people that have had multiple ECTs and has been able to successfully do brain spotting.
Yeah. Great. Laura Hillsheim, for all you people that didn't hear, consulting with people who've had a lot of electroconvulsive therapies, if there's some damage done, or if there's figuring out how to use brain spotting with them. Yes.
So is Colorado, because you mentioned and Mario was there now in August.
Yeah.
And he did a presentation, 3-day presentation on dissociation, I think, with parts work.
It got canceled. It did get canceled. Yeah. Yeah, but he has a book out. Mario has a book out. I don't think it's published in English yet. I think it's just in Spanish.
I have it.
Is it?
Okay.
Oh, do you?
And you can read it.
Yeah.
Do you read it to us? Do an audiobook where you read it in English. I would love it. I'll pay you. Oh my gosh.
Mario's smart dude.
Yeah, he is.
I can see it being a monster.
That's awesome.
Yeah, the goal is to get him over here in the States and to do that.
What's the name of the book? Sorry.
I can take a picture of it. And send it to
What's his
everybody.
last name? Mario what?
Salvador.
Mario Salvador.
Mario Salvador, and you can order it through what's the,
Does it sounds true or?
you can order it through what's the bookstore that's online?
Amazon?
Amazon.
Oh, yeah.
And it takes about 2 weeks to get to you because it has to come from Spain.
Oh.
He's on Brain Spotting Practitioner Facebook, so I bet you if we put something out there, he might be able to.
Other questions?
One
Yeah.
question, going back to, when grounding the client and, getting them out of the flashback, things like that, what do we do if the client is dissociating when grounding them? When the client says, I'm feeling dizzy, I'm gonna throw up, I'm not doing this, or they just, with their eyes closed and I can't go there, it just feels weird, everything's moving. What do we go for it and explore that, or do we stop that exercise and find something else?
Explore it in what way?
Like asking them, notice that, what's that like?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any sensations? What do you feel you are? Or do we completely stop that and just give them some other grounding tool?
Yeah. Well, if it's the end of the session, you need to help them get grounded so they can kind of go on their way. Time constraints sometimes. Maybe switching it up. You can do like the tapping, just have them tap on different parts of their body. Notice this is my arm, this is my shoulder, these are my eyes. Different things where you're really getting them settled into their body. So I would probably use different exercises.
Is that from Waking the Tiger?
Yeah, Waking the Tiger.
He also does like other kind of exercises for people. Yes, and stuff out.
Yeah.
So really, it's have people practice at home or whatever. So
Yeah.
If you go into the shower and you say, I feel the water on me, turn it back.
So Peter Levine, actually, Healing Trauma will have more exercises. It's in the Waking the Tiger, but Healing Trauma, it has all those exercises for people to do at home or in office.
But I mean, in terms of, I've had, probably 100 to 500 people say that they feel like they're going to throw up, and probably only 2 people have thrown up in all of the years that I've been doing it. So a lot of times it just isn't physical sensation. It's just very traumatic dissociation stuff. And so just kind of moving through that.
And that's what I was confused, because I remember from brain spotting, if they are dissociating brain spotting, let them go with it and explore that and notice that.
Yeah.
But when it comes to grounding, do I do the same, explore that, or do I close that and find something else for them to do? Like, that's what I was.
There's a difference though. You're asking us kind of two questions. One part of us is saying, yes, please explore that. And part of us is saying, hey, we know we got to close up shop, so I can get home. So there's two different really things happening there. If you really have to close up shop, then you do all those grounding exercises, whatever you can, and sometimes it takes longer than other times, but it is what it is.
How you feel the client?
Yeah.
Oh, what the client needs.
Yeah, you're not going to harm them by trying to get them grounded. That's not going to hurt them.
One strategy from a Brainspotting perspective is a way to really close the system fast, right? So have them kind of titrate back and forth from kind of near and far. So find a close position and a far position more than 10 feet, and go back and forth between that like every kind of second, and you'll see their system like drop down from like a 9 to a 2.
Conversion. Yeah, they can even do it, just like this. Either way. What else? Anything else? Cool. Well, I learned stuff here, so thank you guys very much.
And everybody, I will be sending you via email certificates of attendance. Okay, so that you can print it off. Yeah, and
Thanks for coming, everybody.
She'll be sending certificates of attendance.
I'm gonna try and put Mario's book up on the Midwest Brainspotting Facebook. Here are flyers for fundraisers and
Exactly.
I was trying to make it seem like, but then when you framed it that way.
Yes, if you're getting CE, yeah, thanks for reminding us. Yeah, if you got CE, please sign out, okay? There's also the sign out sheet's right here. Sorry.
I told you I never love you so
You got two Kathy saying that you got
This thing,
okay, yeah, then you
still have to do it myself. I don't mind if it's expensive.
you are taking
Very
sometimes we need all that. Wait on the long one. All right, we're stopping the recording. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of Deb Bongers at getconnected.works or Cherie Lindbergh. And my email is Cherie, CHERIE, @getconnected.works. Take care.